Crusaders massacre everybody. And then they go to Ma'ara and they capture the city, they massacre the population, and then they ate them. Right from the start, we have this dichotomy of there's this intolerant group of people fighting a tolerant group of people. By the time we get to 630, Palestine was overwhelmingly Christian. He asks to meet the Jewish leadership in the city, and the Christian leadership says, no, we massacred them. We massacred them just 6 years ago. And the Khalifa says, no, this is inappropriate. This is wrong. What's interesting is under Muslim rule, the city ended up being carved into 4 quarters. There were 2 Christian quarters, 1 Jewish quarter, and 1 Muslim quarter.
Give me a sense of how the demography has changed from 730 to 1095 now.
In 1095, the Pope calls for the Crusades. And the idea is that these Western Europeans will then march to Jerusalem, conquer it, and give it to the Roman Empire. By the time we get to, the Crusades, Egypt is still majority Christian.
How do they sort of get momentum, and how much of a shock are they to the societies that encounter them?
They had already done the scientific method. They were already dabbling in calculus. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, this technologically backward society had sent this rampaging army into the heart of their society.
Paint a picture.
Okay.
How do they take Jerusalem?
They would wear a white tunic with a big red cross on the front and back. They swore vows of chastity and they swore vows of poverty, and they were filthy rich rapists. His brother is a man named Shirkuh. He's gruff. He's always angry. He's sarcastic. Nuruddin loved him. There's always a smell of alcohol on Shirkuh's breath. They're opposites in every way. Best friends.
Before we talk about Salahuddin sort of consolidating power, give me a sense of how he got rid of the Fatimids.
There are moments where he was not very merciful. In this moment, he suddenly becomes extremely merciful. And the next thing you know, Salahuddin is fighting all over again, and a massive army comes from Europe.
Looking at that moment in 1919 and European colonialism taking root, is it fair to call that like a fifth crusade?
Goes to Salahuddin's tomb, kicks it, and says, Saladin, we're back. There were Jewish missions throughout the Mediterranean for centuries.
Roy, I apologize. Sorry, I think we haven't been recording. And I'm so sorry about that. Yeah, that really sucks.
It's like a rehearsal run.
Hi, good day, and welcome to another episode of Unapologetic. I'm your host, Ashfaq Karim, and I'm really glad today to welcome back to the show Professor Roy Casagranda. Roy, how are you doing?
I'm good. How about you?
Fantastic. Professor Roy, we had you on the show about 7 or 8 months ago where you spoke about sort of America's interventions and war in the Middle East in the last 100 years. I thoroughly enjoyed that conversation. Our audience have been enjoying it as well. And today you're here to speak about the Crusades and the legacy of the Crusades. So I'm, again, very excited about the conversation. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Cool. Before we actually start with the period of the Crusades, and even sort of speaking about the context and the environment of that gives rise to the Crusades, one of the main reasons why the Crusades occur, if not the main reason, is Jerusalem itself, right? And obviously the city is important to Muslims, to Jews, and to Christians. So before we even get to the sort of 11th century, let's talk about Jerusalem and just why it's so important to all sort of those three religious groups.
Yeah, okay, so I'll start with the Jewish population. Actually, the way I want to frame it is I want to remind everybody that there was a very diverse group of Semites who lived throughout the Levant, Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, and then into Iraq, and then into Arabia. Arabs are Semites. The Hebrew language is a Semitic language. It's a sister language to Arabic. Phoenician is another Semitic language. Aramaic is a very, it was at the time a widespread, widely spoken Semitic language. Usually the Semitic language is divided into Western and Eastern. Aramaic is an Eastern Semitic language, and the other three are Western. But there's a bunch of other examples. I don't want to go into them because most of them are extinct. Really only Aramaic, Hebrew, and Arabic are left. But sometimes when we think of Palestine, we think of it as having just had a Jewish population, and the reality is there was a bunch of different Semitic groups running around in Palestine at the same time. So the Jewish people ended up with possession of a huge portion of Palestine, and that included the city of Jerusalem. And the city of Jerusalem itself is perfectly set for defensive purposes. It's a group of hills with springs inside it, so if you build a wall around it, you now have a city that has access to water. They put gardens in that city so they could even produce some food. And then if an enemy attacked, the surrounding area doesn't have water, so you would have to run a bucket chain all the way back to the Jordan River to bring fresh water for your soldiers. And as a result, it put the Jewish population into a position where they could have some security and some level of stability. It didn't mean that Jerusalem couldn't be conquered, and it got conquered multiple times. It was a harder city to capture. They built the Temple of Solomon there. The city became a center for religious purposes, for cultural purposes. And then the Neo-Babylonian Empire famously conquers Palestine. They're furious at Jewish resistance to that conquest. So to punish the Jewish population, they destroy the first Temple of Solomon, and then they forcibly remove a portion of the Jewish people from Jerusalem and move them to Babylon. And the Neo-Babylonian Empire then has them in captivity. It's not the same as slavery. I think a lot of people conflate the two. It's just that the Jewish people couldn't leave Babylon. They weren't necessarily slaves. I have no doubt that there were Jewish slaves. They just not the group that was held in captivity. Cyrus the Great, Kurosh, the Persian who created the Hachemenishi Empire, one of his great contributions to humanity is he wrote a Bill of Rights. And in that Bill of Rights, he banned things like slavery and human sacrifice. And he also made it so that everybody had the right to practice their religion. He conquers the Neo-Babylonian Empire and then in the process frees the Jews from captivity, which is why he's mentioned in the Old Testament. The Jewish population, then a bunch of it returns to Jerusalem, not all of it. A group actually end up moving to Esfahan. Some stay. But a group moves back to Jerusalem and they want to rebuild the Temple of Solomon. And so they come up with new plans that include a human-made mesa. And they approach the Persians and they say, we want our temple rebuilt because according to the freedom of religion that the definition that Kurosh had for his freedom of religion, the state had to fund temples, their maintenance, their construction, their repairs. And so Persian gold, Egyptian engineers built the Temple Mount and then built the second Temple of Solomon on top of it. And a few centuries later, the Romans conquer Palestine. The Jewish population resists. It turns into a bunch of stone-throwing rebels who refuse to submit. They didn't call them intifadas, but they should have because it's the same exact thing. And long story short, the Romans punished the Jewish population multiple times. There were multiple rebellions. The last one that took place during the last Roman-Persian War, which went from 602 AD until 628 AD, so it lasted about 26 years. What happened was when the Persians invaded Palestine and took it from the Roman Empire, the Jewish population rose up and actually supported the Persians. And the Persians allowed a Jewish autonomous state, kingdom to form in Palestine. Ultimately, the Persians were defeated, and in their surrender terms, the Persians insisted that the Romans accept that they wouldn't do vengeance against the Jewish people. About 1.5, 2 years after the surrender treaty was ratified, the Roman Emperor Heraclius actually broke it and then massacred the Jewish population in Palestine in act of vengeance, and then began a process of forced conversions. And so I think one way to think of Jerusalem is not only does it have direct religious importance to the Jewish people, it also has very significant identity value, especially surrounding the idea of resistance and survival. And this was our city, but we lose it, but we get it back. There's kind of a sense of at some point the Jewish people will always return back to Jerusalem, even if they lose it again to somebody else like the Romans or the Neo-Babylonians. So in a nutshell, I think that's the gist of why it's so important to the Jewish people.
Okay, so we sort of started just before the Babylonians, and now we're in 630 AD, and something very important happens during that period, which is the birth of Jesus Christ, right?
Yeah.
So tell us how that sort of impacts Jerusalem specifically, and the Christian relationship with the city, not just in terms of symbolism, but also in terms of demography and when they actually settle in the city, and how their presence in the city is, what it does to the city and how it impacts it.
Okay, so one of the things, it's important to remember Jesus was Jewish, but one of the things you have to also remember is that Judaism and Christianity it's a serious break. Judaism is a henotheistic religion as opposed to a monotheistic religion. And the difference between the two is, in monotheism, you believe there is one God. Done. There's no conversation past that. In henotheism, you believe there's one God for your people, but then you believe that other peoples could have other gods. And so there might be a multi-deity universe. It's just your people don't have that. Your people have one God. And so what Jesus basically says is that religion, Judaism, needs an update. And the update is that that religion belongs to everybody on earth. It's not just for Jews. And there is only one God for everybody on earth. And so in a way, it's the serious break, which is why it was not easy for the Jewish population to simply convert. So the people who did convert to Judaism actually went out and did missions elsewhere and began converting.
You mean convert to Christianity?
Convert to Christianity.
Yeah.
So think of like St. Paul, St. Peter, and as they're running around, St. Mark, as these guys are running around, they're not converting the Jewish population to Christianity. They're going to Armenia, and they're going to Egypt, and they're going to central Turkey, and they're going to Italy. They're ending up in Spain and even in Switzerland eventually, and they're converting all these people who were mostly pagan over to Christianity. And of course, Jesus' story takes place not entirely in Jerusalem, but largely in Jerusalem, including his ultimate execution. And so for Christianity, because he's executed in Jerusalem and because he spent so much of his time in Jerusalem, the city took on serious importance to the Christian faith. And then you want me to go into why it's important to Islam as well?
Well, I mean, obviously, but I mean, even before we get there, just sort of, because obviously, I mean, we can speak about symbolically why it's important to Islam. But when for example, Heracles takes over the city, and I'm assuming he's forcibly converting the Jews into Christians. So what is the Christian presence already in the city at that point? Exactly. By the time we get to 630, Palestine was overwhelmingly Christian. The Roman Empire began converting to Christianity in the first century. It was slow. The Roman Empire was resisting, sometimes violently. In the second century, there's this, it's still going through this process. In the third century, the Roman Empire ends up in really big trouble. And it begins to break apart. In fact, the Roman Empire at one point broke up into three empires. And there's an emperor named Diocletian or Diocletian, and he puts the empire back together through force. And then he cuts it into four pieces, and he creates two emperors and then two co-emperors, so that the four emperors will sort of run the empire. And then famously, the next emperor, Constantine, undoes everything and becomes the only emperor. And then after him, it goes back to two emperors. But they stabilized the Roman Empire. And part of doing that was, in the crisis of the third century, there was a large conversion to Christianity. Because people, as their security was falling apart, they found that, making a sacrifice to Jupiter just wasn't very satisfying anymore. Whereas the promise of Christianity seemed to fit with people in crisis better. And so there was a lot of conversion. So Emperor Constantine had a problem. And the problem was, what am I going to do with this really large Christian population? I can't ignore it anymore. So what he did was he made it so that Christianity was one of the two official religions of the empire. I don't remember the emperor off the top of my head, but there's an emperor about half a century later who makes it so Christianity is the only legal religion, only official religion. And then Emperor Theodosius
in 391 puts out an edict declaring that Christianity is the only legal religion in the empire. Not, the earlier one was official. This one is legal. So if you're Jewish or pagan, you are no longer allowed to live in the empire. And this results in a little bit of a catastrophe in Alexandria. The Great Library is burnt, and the Jewish population is massacred. But by that point, by 391, the Roman Empire, from Palestine to Spain, the whole thing is overwhelmingly majority Christian. There were still pockets of Jewish and pagan populations, but not many. So when Emperor Heraclius does this to the Jews in Palestine, he's massacring a small minority, even in Palestine, like not just the empire itself.
Okay, and then the Prophet Muhammad is born in about 570 AD. And how does that change the scene? So,
because Islam sees itself in many ways as, Christianity updated, it's following this path of Judaism, Christianity, Islam. Because of that, a lot of the stories follow over, and all of the prophets follow over, and of course Jesus plays this really important role in Islam. And so the city itself became a focal point as being one of the three most religious cities in Islam, obviously with Mecca and Medina. And in Islam, Christians and Jews have access to heaven. So it's a religion that doesn't say this is the only path to salvation. There are other paths to salvation. I think the idea might be expressed as Islam is the best path to salvation, is the one we are most likely to succeed, but that doesn't mean that it rules out other paths. Eventually, Zoroastrianism was accepted as a path to salvation as well. And so when the Muslims conquer Palestine, which is the conquest begins in 634, and then the Battle of Yarmouk is in 636, Jerusalem is captured shortly after the Battle of Yarmouk. When that happens, it becomes really important in the minds of the leadership, Umar ibn al-Khattab, the Khalifa, that there'd be a Jewish presence in Jerusalem. And when they enter the city, when the city surrenders, and Jerusalem was captured peacefully, when the city surrenders, he asks to meet the Jewish leadership in the city. And the Christian leadership says, no, we massacred them. We massacred them just 6 years ago. Like this place was just emptied out. And the Khalifa says, no, this is inappropriate. This is wrong. And he turns to a person who was a Jewish Yemeni who had converted to Islam, and he asks him to go and actually find multiple Jewish families to voluntarily move to Jerusalem so that there can be this Jewish presence there. And so another thing that he does that I think is really important is the Archbishop of Jerusalem, his name was Sophronius. Sophronius actually invited the Khalifa to go into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and pray with him. And Omar said, no, I believe that if I do that, your church will be seized from you and turned into a mosque, because it's the first place that a Khalifa prayed in Jerusalem, and I respect you and I respect your religion too much to do this. And so let's go find an empty space to pray in. And so I want to pray with you. I just don't want you to lose your church. And of course, the Khalifa was right. The spot that they prayed in eventually became a mosque, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre still belongs to Christianity. And so when the Muslims took Jerusalem, they treated it like a holy city, and they made it very clear to the Jewish and Christian populations that they had a space, they had a place, and that place was a place of honor and respect. What's interesting is under Muslim rule, the city ended up being carved into 4 quarters. There were 2 Christian quarters, 1 Jewish quarter, and 1 Muslim quarter. And so even though the city was holy for all 3 religions, Christians sort of got priority under Muslim rule and did very well under Muslim rule. But Jews did great too. It's just population-wise, the Christians were bigger.
And sort of, so how long did the Muslims rule the city for? And does it sort of, is that spirit of tolerance there for until the Crusaders arrive on the scene? How does the city develop? How does the region change? And sort of like, let's what's that terrain like up until about probably the year about 1050 when the Crusades are about to start occurring?
Okay, so for 4.5 centuries from the Muslim capture of Jerusalem until the Crusades start, there were moments when tolerance levels dropped a little bit, and then there were moments when it's higher. On average, it was a period of tolerance. Christian and Muslim populations thrived under Muslim rule. You can always find that moment where there was a leader who did something kind of nasty. The thing that pops into my head was there was an early Fatimid leader who tried to close down the churches in Egypt, for example. And then the very next Fatimid leader rescinds that order and goes, no, this is crazy. We're not doing that. So, you get the kind of leadership that you can get in every society where it ebbs and flows. But for the most part, Jews and Christians did very well. The Crusaders, of course, will rule the city for a few decades. On the other side of it, that tolerance actually returned. And so if you look at the period from 636 until 1948, is that the year we want to use, or do we want to use 1919 when the British take it? Let's go with 1919 with the end.
I think 1919 makes more sense. Yeah, but I mean, look, it's up to you. Yeah.
It was a city of tolerance, with the exception of the Crusader period. It was a place where people peacefully coexisted and thrived, and so it's really hard to find fault with what was going on during Muslim rule in that city. And then again, I'm sure you can find this every once in a while. There's a bad leader who did something that you point to and go, oh, maybe that wasn't great, but for the most part, it was.
Okay, so you're saying that the city was kind of peaceful, and I'm sure a lot of that by extension means that the region was more or less tolerant. I mean, my own understanding of the history of these various Islamic sort of empires and sub-empires that emerge is that it's mainly sort of a lot of court battles, right? A lot of empires, families taking out families so that they can rule smaller or bigger chunks of land. I mean, just your own impressions on that, but sort of what gives rise to this need for a crusade then? And I mean, I'm guessing there's already sort of some like a legacy sort of beef that's occurring, right, between Christians and Muslims that starts not just over the Crusades, but maybe a bit bigger. And why does why does that sort of legacy come into existence if the Muslim Empire is so tolerant? And then why do the Crusades? Why are they sort of announced by the popes?
Yeah. So when the Muslim Empire, actually, let me rephrase that because I don't like that term. When the Arab Empire is created, which it starts in 633 when Khalid ibn al-Walid takes his army into what is today Kuwait. It was part of the Persian Empire at the time. From that moment, the Muslim, by the time you get to about 711, so 633 to 711 is at 78 years, the Arab Empire stretched from Spain to Pakistan, and it actually went into Central Asia. So it became the largest empire to that date. There have been empires much bigger after that, but nothing was bigger before that. And it was built in a very fast period of time, right? 78 years is nothing. At that moment, it was majority Christian, so probably around 60 or so % Christian. But also, the majority of the world's Christians lived in that empire. So there was sort of like a moment of, here's this empire that's about 5% Muslim. Maybe it was, 2% Jewish. It was probably about 10% Buddhist. It was probably about 15% Zoroastrian. And it's 60% Christian. And the majority of the world's Christians live in it. And I think it kind of broke the minds of the Roman Empire and Western Europe, because they thought of themselves as the bastions of Christianity fighting against Muslim expansion.
Okay, so this demographic is probably like around about the year 730, 740, just to sort of have a timeline.
Yes, yeah. 711 is the year I picked, but it'll be the same in 730.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. So, Western Europe was Catholic, Eastern Europe was Orthodox. They hadn't officially split until, 1054? With the Great Schism, but they've already separated politically, right? Because you have the Pope in Rome who doesn't get along with the Patriarch of Constantinople. They're constantly bickering back and forth, which is why there'll be the Great Schism in the 11th century. But they saw themselves as the bulwarks against Muslim expansion. And so they saw Islam as this horrible religion that had to be stopped at all costs, and they were intolerant. Those Christian states, whether it was, the thing that Charlemagne rules that becomes France, or the Roman Empire, they did not have a concept of tolerance. Non-Christians were not accepted. It was not okay to be Jewish or Muslim in those states. And they even had expressed intentions of pushing out the Muslim populations. So once the kingdoms in the north of what is today Spain are formed, the Christian kingdoms, their express goal is to conquer all of the Iberian Peninsula and drive the Muslims out and expel or convert the Jewish and Muslim populations. So right from the start, we have this dichotomy of there's this intolerant group of people fighting a tolerant group of people. And the reality then doesn't matter, right? When you're intolerant, you always see the other side as bad, no matter how good they are, because you just don't like them. That's the nature of the relationship. And so that's exactly what was happening. It didn't matter that you could go to Jerusalem if you were a Christian. In their minds, Christians should own Jerusalem. And what happened was the Roman Empire suffered a series of really nasty defeats. Alexios Komnenos, the Roman emperor, actually went to the Pope in Rome in 1095 and said, we're getting really badly beaten. We've lost Antioch. We're being pushed in central Anatolia. Things are grim, and I need help. And the Pope in Rome said, we have, I don't get along with the Patriarch of Constantinople, but obviously we need to be working together. You got to remember that the Roman Empire has lost the city of Rome. The Charlemagne had actually broken the city of Rome out. So the Pope in Rome is the Duke of the city of Rome. And he is, a ruler in and of himself. And he says, okay, I'll see what I can do. And so in 1095, the Pope calls for the Crusades. And the idea is that these Western Europeans will then march to Jerusalem, conquer it, and give it to the Roman Empire. The Pope calls for the Crusades in 1095. Nothing happens. The next year, a guy named Peter the Hermit gets up in front of everybody and says, we should really do what the Pope asked for last year, and then the Crusades actually start.
Okay, so is Peter is he close to the Pope, like physically? Is he somewhere else?
Just some random guy in France.
Okay, so I mean, he may have met the Pope, but it's not like he's in the same city or the capital or where the Vatican is. None of that sort. And so, before we actually start with the Crusades moving, give me a sense of how the demography has changed from 730 to 1095 now, because now I'm assuming it's majority Muslim. Over the years, people have converted. There's been a lot of infighting in various sort of Muslim and Arab and Persian and Turkish empires by now, which make up the Arab world. So what's the formerly united Arab empire which swept from Spain to Pakistan? What's that like now? And then we can start with the Crusades.
Yeah. Okay. So the Arab Empire doesn't last very long. It was built really quickly and it implodes really quickly. The first piece comes off. It's Spain in, I think it was either 734 or 736. 754 or 756. Spain breaks away from the Arab Empire, and it just little by little it loses Morocco a few years after that. By 890, what is today northern Syria, southern Turkey, and northern Iraq breaks away. And then in 934, the Buyids break away. The Buyids were Persians who had actually been very heavily involved in the Abbasid court, and they just sort of carved out a chunk of Persia from the Arab Empire and began ruling it on their own, and then slowly kept expanding until the Buyids literally captured Baghdad and captured the Khalifa, So by that point, I think sometime around, I don't know exactly the year you need to call the Arab Empire dead, but by 934, as the Buyids are going off and doing their own thing, I think it's pretty much dead. The Fatimids break away. So one of the things that's interesting is because there wasn't any meaningful forced conversion going on in the Arab Empire, it was only slowly and organically converting to Islam. There wasn't, this mad rush to the religion. One of the things driving it, strangely enough, was the tax code. If you were not a Muslim, you paid a specific amount of gold. An ounce or maybe 2 ounces of gold per year. It fluctuated a little bit. It was something like that. If you were a Muslim, you paid a percentage, and that had to go to taking care of the poor and the infirm and the sick. So, in other words, the Arab Empire was actually a social welfare state. And Muslims paid into the social welfare state, and then non-Muslims, with that chunk of gold they had to give, that money could be spent on anything. So that's how the state operated. So there was also an incentive on the part of the state to not encourage too much conversion, because it would mean that their taxes that they would be able to spend on an army or building roads would become limited. And then if you were rich, you wanted to pay the lump sum. If you were poor, you wanted to pay the percentage. So the majority of people converting were actually poor. And so Islam sort of organically grew out of the poor population in the empire. And, the rich Zoroastrians, rich Christians, and rich Jews sort of hesitated in converting. So that by the time we get to, the Crusades, Egypt is still majority Christian. It was probably 2/3 Christian at this point. Egypt didn't probably become majority Muslim until right around the year 1300. It may have been a little bit earlier, but right around there. Palestine had a massive Christian population. It was probably 40% Christian by the time the Crusades started. Syria had a very significant Christian population. It was probably 25%, somewhere in that area. So it wasn't homogenous by any means. And I think we just assumed that this was a Christian-Muslim conflict because that's how it's always portrayed. But it really wasn't, in part because the Arab world was so diverse religiously and ethnically, right? There was also, by the time we got to about the year 900, Egypt had become majority Arabic speaking, but it was still speaking the pharaonic language. It was still around. It's Coptic. And so, maybe as much as 40% of the Egyptian population was speaking Coptic instead of speaking Arabic. And there was still a huge Aramaean population in Palestine and Syria. They were speaking Aramaic. There was a huge Armenian population. There was a huge Kurdish population. And then, of course, the mercenaries that were being hired to operate the armies were Turks. So there was a huge Turkish population. So it was a multi-ethnic, multi-religious society. And then, of course, there was a significant Jewish population. Jews were, relatively still a small population, but as a percentage of the population, there were more Jews in the Middle East than there were in Europe. And they were an integral part of the society as well. By contrast, in Europe, right, by the time we get to the Crusades, the West has become Catholic, the East is Orthodox, and there is ethnic diversity for sure, but there's no religious diversity. It's you're either on one side or the other, and there isn't any wiggle room. There's no tolerance for the non-Catholics or the non-Orthodox.
Again, I think a key point that we need to make is that the Christian populations who are in what's called the Middle East now are Orthodox. They're not Catholic, right? And the Pope's Catholic, and the Crusade is coming as a sort of Catholic crusade.
Well, with an exception, the Maronites were Catholic. The Maronites were an indigenous Catholic population that had been in what is today Lebanon for centuries. I want to say 4 or 5 centuries before the Crusaders showed up. So there was actually an indigenous Catholic population as well, strangely enough. So it wasn't quite the East-West split. But you're right, the majority of the Christian population was definitely Orthodox. Okay. Or Armenian, because I think the Armenians don't identify as Orthodox, even though I think everybody identifies them as Orthodox.
Okay, so the Crusaders start. We're going to speak about them, I guess, for the next while, and we're going to probably speak about the next 100 years. And in those 100 years, there's 4 Crusades. Now, obviously, we can't cover all of that, and I think I may have mentioned already that you've done sort of 6 hours on YouTube covering those 4 Crusades. We're going to try to get through that now, probably in about an hour, and then spend the next sort of time we have here speaking about the last 200 years or so, and sort of the clash of civilizations. I hate that term, but or rather, let's call it the remnants and legacy of the Crusades. But yeah, the Crusades start. I guess the question I want to ask is, how do they sort of get momentum, and how much of a shock are they to the societies that encounter them, and why are they a shock?
Okay, I'm going to hold off on the shock. Let me start with the other part of it, because the shock was really a shock. I think nobody was prepared for what happened. So one of the things that's interesting about the Crusades is its timing connected to the Viking conversion to Christianity. All of a sudden, these Viking populations that had been, I almost said the word terrorizing. I'm a quarter Swedish, so I take offense to that. Let's see, how should we put this? Making the world a better place by killing English? That's wrong too. That's definitely wrong. On rampaging, that's a word I can go with. Okay, so the Viking populations were rampaging through Northern Europe. And, they had conquered whole swaths of Ireland and England and Scotland. They were in northern France. They were in northern Germany, what is today Poland, in the Baltic states. And they had cut through Russia and Ukraine multiple times, over and over and over again, to the point where eventually the Vikings took over in what is today Ukraine. And they created a state called Kievan Rus. Rus, R-U-S, was the name of one of the Viking tribes. And that's where the word Russia comes from. So the Russians are actually named after a Viking tribe. So that gives you kind of a sense of where they were. By the 11th century, the Vikings are mass converting to Christianity. And instead of being raiders on a rampage, they're slowly becoming lords. So they own northern France. Normandy was named after the Normans. They conquered England. They will actually go and they will become mercenaries in southern Italy, and in the process decide, why are we working for somebody else when we could just be our own guys? And they take over southern Italy and Sicily. And then the Pope calls for a crusade against Saragossa, the city in northern Spain, and a group of Normans go along for the ride, and it's sort of a test case, and they capture the city from the Muslims, and the Normans fall madly in love with the city, and they settle there. They begin dressing like Arabs. They learn how to read and write Arabic. They begin reading in Arabic literature and getting to Arabic poetry. They Arabize. And shortly afterwards, the Crusades are called for. And so in a way, I think one of the driving forces for the Crusades was it was a means to get rid of some of the Normans, that they didn't know what to do with all these recently converted Christian Vikings. And they thought, man, if we could just send them somewhere to go kill somebody else, it'd be a really great idea. Another reason to do it was, I think in the mind of the Pope anyway, instead of having Catholics murder each other and, disputes in Germany or disputes in France, you could just send them somewhere else and unify them around this struggle against another religion and another group of people. And then I think all of them thought, from the lowest level peasant to the top level noble, if we could capture Jerusalem, this is a lot of glory for Jesus. We'll go straight to heaven. And there's no better pathway to go to heaven than to die in combat fighting for Jesus to try to take Jerusalem back. So there was a huge chunk of this that was just religiously driven. I'm sure, because I think I have a sneaky suspicion that the majority of people at the top, whether they're kings or presidents, are probably a bunch of atheist narcissists who only believe in themselves, and they just do lip service to whatever religion happens to be dominant. So I'm sure there were guys like that at the top of the leadership, but at the same time, we also know there are a bunch of fanatics as well. So it was sort of a mix of fanaticism and surplus military laying around that they didn't know what to do with, and I think that was a driving force. The shock element actually started in Europe. The first thing the Crusaders did was they went on a rampage along the Rhine River in what is today Germany, murdering the local Jewish population and raping the Jewish women in the area to the tune of several thousand people. And then they launched the Crusade and actually headed to the Middle East. So they started off with a massacre, mass rape event of Jews before they then set out to go to the Holy Land. The first wave to go through Eastern Europe was sort of the peasant crusade. It wasn't the part of the crusade that was led by nobles. And they were attacking peasants, even though they were peasants, and they were plundering the countryside, and they became such a nuisance. The king of Hungary actually launched an army to go hunt them down and try and destroy them, and they ultimately are destroyed. The wave that came behind them was the wave of Crusaders that were led by nobles, and they were in real military formations. They also did plundering, but if you're the king of Hungary, you don't want to fight them. So a lot of the Christian states along the path just sort of tolerated them. And they got to Constantinople, and the Roman emperor realized what a mess these people were, and he spent his whole time trying to figure out how to get them across the Bosporus and out of the Roman Empire and off fighting. And they'll end up fighting the Turks along the way, and then they get to Antioch. And Antioch is going to become it's not the first Crusader state, it's the second one. The first one that was created was Edessa, but in a way, it kind of inaugurates how the Crusaders are going to behave. They had the city under siege, but they just didn't have the ability to get in. And Turkish reinforcements were slowly working their way towards the city. And if the Turks got to the city before the Crusaders got into it, that was probably the end of the Crusades. Like, there was probably no way for them to recover. So they knew things were really desperate. And at some point, they talked to somebody inside the city, and they said, "We swear, if you surrender the city is running out of food. People were desperate. They didn't know how close the Turks were. So they're operating in fog of war kind of situation. And the Crusaders promise that if the city surrenders, nobody will be harmed." So somebody inside the city betrays everybody, opens the gates, the Crusaders come in, and the Crusaders disarm the garrison. And when the last Muslim soldier drops the last sword into the pile, the Crusaders massacre everybody. And then they go to Ma'ara, and they capture the city, they massacre the population, and then they ate them. They cooked the dead people of Ma'ara, and they ate them. So it was this horrific cannibalism event. And they kept doing these horrible massacre events, one after the other, until they got to Jerusalem. They didn't, even though the Crusades launched in 1096, they didn't get to Jerusalem until 1098. It took them 2 years. But when they finally did get to Jerusalem, they had already established themselves as this fierce, terroristic military machine that was going to massacre civilian populations. And so there was widespread fear of them by that point.
I mean, given the extent of the brutality, I want to discuss. I mean, audience may not be aware. So, Antioch's just basically right now in southern Turkey, right, and then Ma'ara is between like Aleppo and Homs, I guess, somewhere there on the map, right, and then they move south, right. Why, given that they this massive rampaging army that is clearly making destruction and destroying what societies that seem to have had more or less sort of multiculturalism for the last 300 years, why was there no resistance to them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the technically was, all those cities were holding out, but they were failing to hold out. The real problem was there was no functioning state anymore. So when the Arab Empire broke up, it broke up into multiple states. There were, the Fatimids ended up with Egypt. The Umayyads, who had been overthrown by the Abbasids, ended up with Spain. The Buyids ended up with Central Persia. The Buyids themselves get into trouble and then are ultimately replaced by the Seljuks. The Seljuks created an empire. It was a group of Turkish mercenaries who basically rose up and decided they were going to rule themselves. The Buyids were Persians. When they did this, the Seljuks decided that Persian civilization was the coolest civilization ever. So they ended up with a lot of Persian leadership they celebrated the Persian language, Persian poetry, but the top leadership was Turkish. They made a state that stretched from Syria basically to Pakistan. And that state slowly began to disintegrate right before the Roman Empire arrived. So even though the Romans, not Roman Empire, I meant the Crusaders. Even though the Romans had suffered this serious setback in what is now central Turkey and Anatolia, the Seljuk state was actually in really bad shape. And basically each warlord, so the Atabeg who ruled Mosul, for example, didn't see their allegiance necessarily to the Atabeg who was ruling Aleppo. They saw them as a fellow rival. And so when the Crusaders showed up, you weren't getting the kind of cooperation you would expect for, oh my God, we're being invaded, let's bring an army out. Instead it was, oh, that guy's getting attacked by these Europeans. That might work to my benefit. I'm going to let him get destroyed, and then I'm going to go see if I can pick up the pieces. And of course, that turned out to be a really dumb and naive position to take because, when you go to pick up the pieces, you discover that the Crusaders have dug in and you're not going to dig them back out. Well, for 2 centuries anyway. So there was a lot of short-sighted, bitter rivalries in this really weakened Seljuk Empire. The Seljuk Empire doesn't really survive the Crusades. It collapses even before the Mongols show up.
Okay, so I think a lot of it's also, it sounds like, it's not just not strategic and short-sightedness, but they think this is sort of like a marauding band that won't have sustainability, and they end up being a lot more sustainable.
Yeah, I totally think there was this naive assessment of, they're just raiders. And
yes. They'll go back
leave,
eventually, and let's just avoid them so that we can retain our resources, meaning our military resources and everything else, and let's stay out of their way until they get back, and then we can. Almost that perspective. Let's.
Not quite. I think they believe, especially once they started carving out places like Antioch and Edessa. Oh, it looks like they're going to stay. I think there was a lot of but then once I'm in a position because I don't have to deal with this rival, I can go and I'll take that one.
We'll get to them later, kind of thing. Okay, so. We haven't yet discussed how they eventually take Jerusalem. It just paints a picture. How do they take Jerusalem?
When the Crusaders show up at Jerusalem in 1098, they don't have any siege equipment. So here's this city that is designed to be something that's very difficult to capture. And so they've got a bucket chain that goes to the Jordan River. And you can imagine several kilometers of men passing buckets of water to each other. They probably created their own river just from the water dripping out of the buckets. And they're trying to figure out how to capture the city. They don't know how to do it. Out of nowhere, a Genovese fleet shows up and lands on the west coast, Palestine, on the west coast of Palestine, and they had siege equipment. And they brought it to Jerusalem. And the Crusaders are like, wow, all our prayers, Jesus sent us siege equipment. This is incredible. So they begin the process of attacking the city in a serious manner. They'd actually tried several times before, but there was no point. They were just getting their men killed. And by the way, by the time they get to Jerusalem, that's a fraction of the army that left Europe. I want to say it was like 10% the size of the original army. In part because guys had stayed behind, like Raymond I carves off Tripoli, and Bohemond I takes Antioch, and Jocelyn I takes Edessa. Right? There's these guys have carved off their own little territories. They don't need to go to Jerusalem, and so a lot of men stayed behind. Some died. Some turned around and went back to Europe. So they're down to about 10% of the army. They attack the city now with this siege equipment, and they manage to capture a whole section of wall. The problem is the citadel, which is frequently called the Tower of David. It has nothing to do with King David. It just got that name. The citadel was still owned by Egyptians because the Fatimids had captured Jerusalem just a few years earlier. So the Seljuks hated the Fatimids and hated the Romans. So the Romans and the Fatimids became allies. And they began working together against the Seljuks. And the idea was that the Crusaders were going to be the third piece of this alliance, that they were going to help the Romans and the Fatimids against the Seljuks. And right before the Crusaders arrived in Jerusalem, the Fatimids had just captured the city. So when the Crusaders are coming, the Fatimids are like, why are you coming? We already took it. You don't need to take it. We've got it now. And then they realize, oh my God, they're going to take it from us. This alliance is already falling apart. We're being betrayed. So the Fatimids are inside the citadel. They're holding on to it. And the Crusaders approach them and they're like, what do we need to do for you to surrender? And the Egyptian soldiers go, we know what you did at Antioch. We know what you did in Ma'ara. There's countless other towns where you've done these kinds of massacres. We know that the moment we surrender, you're just going to murder us anyway. So we're better off fighting to the death, knowing that we'll kill some of you before we die. And we'll be the architects of our death instead of being, executed and boiled and eaten. At least we can die in battle. And so the Crusaders go, look, we'll make you a deal where you can escape. You'll leave this citadel 10 at a time. That way, if we betray you, we'll only kill the 10 guys who happen to be out at that moment. And as you're leaving, it'll actually improve your ability to hold out because your food supply will last longer if there's fewer men defending. So we have every incentive to let all of you out. And the Egyptians went, okay. And so they start leaving 10 at a time. That last 10 guys to go must have been just peeing their pants as they're running. Like, oh my God, they'll betray us. But they didn't. They let them all go. And then they closed the gates to the city. And they went to the Jewish quarter and they began massacring the population. They went to the Muslim quarter and they began massacring the population. And in the midst of all of this, a lot of the Jews decided, and a lot of the Muslims decided, let's just go to our synagogues and mosques, and we can barricade them and try and defend ourselves there. But more importantly, we'll just pray, and then we'll die in the act of praying. One of the Crusaders that was there, his name was Tancred, he couldn't believe what they were doing. He was shocked. And in his account, he said that he stepped into a gutter and the blood was knee deep. I find that hard to envision. I think he must have been exaggerating. But in any case, he says there's blood everywhere. People are being massacred. And he tried to stop the massacre. He went up to a group of Muslims and he said, here's my banner. And he handed them the banner. And his banner was a purple flag with a yellow cross on it. And he said, if a Crusader comes up to you, just tell them you're with me, that I've granted you my protection. And then he went looking for other Muslim families to try to save. And as the day went on, he went back to check on that one that he'd given them the banner, and he found his banner entangled in their bodies. The Crusaders that came upon them just massacred them anyway. They didn't care. It was just a frenzy, violent event. When the Crusaders would capture a mosque, they would get in there and they'd kill everybody. They just mopped it out. They mopped the blood out, went up to the top of the minarets, knocked off the crescent moons, and stuck crosses up. When they got to the synagogues, they believed there was no way to cleanse the synagogue because Jews were just so awful. So they just piled wood around them and burned the Jews alive inside the synagogues. And then when they were done massacring the Jewish quarter and the Muslim quarter, they went to the two Christian quarters and they said, let's see your clergy. So the clergy stepped out, they massacred the clergy, and they said, you guys are no longer Orthodox. And then they pointed to their Catholic priests and they said, you are now Catholic. Congratulations, these are your clergy. And that's how they captured Jerusalem.
Okay, before we actually move on to sort of how the rule kind of works out and how Muslim resistance eventually Muslim/Arab/ the regional, local resistance, domestic resistance kind of collates to eventually take back Jerusalem and other cities as well. Just a few points to get a sense of how this operation's working. So you said the Genoese sort of came out of nowhere, right? I mean, is it possible that there was some communications going on? It's like, hey, we're about to move on Jerusalem. Maybe you want to be part of this. That's one thing. And then also, because I think it's important to start dealing with, and in a macro way, not in a micro way, because we haven't got time for it, but sort of inter-Crusader politics. And you mentioned Tancred. Was Tancred Genoese? Was he one of the later arrivals? Because if he was with the Crusades from the start, then obviously the massacring wouldn't have been a shock to him, right? Like you'd have seen this been occurring. So just what's your knowledge on that?
Yeah. So Tancred actually got separated from the Crusaders at one point, and one of the reasons was he was trying to carve out his own territory. separately from the others. And so I think he missed out on some of the massacring. Like, I believe he was in Edessa when Antioch was massacred, and he missed the whole Ma'ara thing. And then he rejoined the Crusaders in time to get there for Jerusalem. And so he was shocked, but he shouldn't have been, because surely he heard the rumors of what was going on. I think the Genovese figured out, they were probably thinking, oh my God, those idiots are on their way to Jerusalem without any siege equipment, and went and got the siege equipment. But there was no way there was any communication. The Crusaders were they were moving, first of all, too straight of a line. They weren't, looping back, and the Genovese had their own agenda. So I would be shocked if they had real communication. But I think the Genovese kind of figured it out for the Crusaders. When they captured Jerusalem, they want to create a state. So they were supposed to hand Jerusalem over to the Roman Empire. What they did was they said Antioch, the Principality of Antioch, will become part of the Roman Empire, but only nominally. So in other words, it'll be a Crusader state that pays taxes to the Romans and pays lip service to the Roman Emperor, but it won't really be in either one. It'll be in both, the Crusader states and the Roman Empire. Edessa and Tripoli became counties, so they want to create a kingdom. The guy who was in charge of the expedition was a guy named Godfrey, and Godfrey said, I cannot wear a crown because Jesus wore a crown of thorns. And so he said, I refuse to become the king. But he effectively became the king, just never took the title. He only ruled for a few months and he died. I don't even think he made it a whole year. And he gets replaced by Baldwin the First. And Tancred actually ended up becoming the Prince of Galilee. So there was, on paper anyway, a fifth Crusader state, but it never took. It just ended up being part of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And I think in part it was just Tancred didn't fit politically. Like, he wanted to be part of Antioch, he wanted to be part of Edessa, he was trying to figure out where to fit, and I don't think he had the psychology. He probably just wasn't evil enough to make it work.
Okay, so paint a picture for me on how the capture or the fall of Jerusalem impacts the local society, and not just in Palestine, but sort of regional society, because Jerusalem at that point is symbolic for all the inhabitants, I'm assuming, to some extent. And also just what the Crusader states were like until about the year 1150, 1160. And then obviously that will then move to Salahuddin's emergence, I guess.
Yeah, so I think the answer is shock. People just couldn't believe what had happened. All of a sudden, out of nowhere, this technologically backward society had sent this rampaging army into the heart of their society and had captured a swath of land right in the middle, right? A way to think of this is the distance between Cairo and Damascus, if you flew as a bird, so you flew over the Mediterranean, is 600 kilometers. So if you went by land, snaky roads, maybe it's a 800 kilometer trip. It's not a really big distance. For an American audience, it's less than the distance from Austin to Albuquerque. There, we're not talking about a really big distance, but all of a sudden there's a Crusader state jammed in between, which made it so it was impossible to do without traveling through that Crusader territory, which was dangerous. You didn't want to do it because the Crusaders were raiding Muslim caravans. And so they have the coast, so there's no way to go by water, and they have the land all the way down to Aqaba. So there was no way to go by land without crossing through that Crusader state. And so I think there was this just shock, like how did this happen? How is there this wedge of land jammed in the middle of us? Especially because you got to remember, by the time that we're 1099, by the time Baldwin the First is king, the Arabs had already, and the Persians, because some of the achievements I'm going to talk about were actually done by Persians, they had already created modern agriculture, modern medicine. They had already done the scientific method. They were already dabbling in calculus. They had figured out that all objects in the universe exert gravity, that light travel at a finite speed in waves. Major achievements, major accomplishments. By contrast, in Europe, right? They didn't have functioning sewers. Their roads were made out of mud. They had abandoned science. They had abandoned philosophy. They could barely do mathematics, and so it was just Western Europe was not the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was more technologically advanced, but Western Europe was just seen as this really primitive backwater.
And of course, when you say the Roman Empire, you meaning Constantinople. You're not meaning Rome. Just yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Yes.
So most people call it the Byzantine Empire. There was never any such entity called Byzantine Empire. There was a German named Hieronymus Wolff who renamed the last 1,000 years of the Roman Empire the Byzantine Empire because he wanted the Roman Empire to have been destroyed by Germans because he was a German, not by Muslims because he hated the fact that the Roman Empire was destroyed by the Ottoman Empire. So anyway, so that's why I keep referring to it as the Roman Empire. Of course.
No, I'm mentioning that just so the audience doesn't get confused, if they get confused. Okay, just question before we start with Salahuddin. How did the state, which was, I mean, I'm talking about Crusader state, sustain itself? Were there Crusader migrants arriving all the time? People sort of heard about, and kind of like, was there sort of some settler movement of soldiers, if not normal people? Like, how were they sustaining their various, not just Jerusalem, but Antioch and Tripoli and everything else?
So part of it was they had the Venetian Navy. So the Genovese were involved also, especially in the beginning. But the Venetians really came in and bailed the Crusaders out. The Crusaders were actually done in the first few years. They didn't have the economics. There was no way they were going to make a stable state. And the Venetians basically said, we will give you a bunch of money. We will give you a fleet so that you can move goods around and move people around. In return, you give us 1 out of every 4 acres. And what they meant by that was you peasantize the Arab population. You have to remember that sometime between 750 and 800, Arabs had invented private property. So when they did that, they freed all the peasants and gave them private property. So that the idea of having peasants was alien to that population. But the Europeans, of course, did peasants. So when these Crusaders come, they peasantize the Arab population. The 1 out of every 4 acres, then the profits from that land would go to the Venetians. And so they didn't have much in terms of trade, but they certainly had agricultural capacity. And then people were coming in to do pilgrimages. So in other words, they were making a lot of money off of the religious tourism. And then the rest of it was patrons in Europe sending them money to support them and prop up the economy because there was no functioning reason for them to exist, right? It didn't make any sense. They took the region backwards technologically, and they weren't providing anything unique or new. And so, there was no reason for them to exist financially other than support from Europe. Okay. And then a constant, steady stream of soldiers were coming in.
Okay, so and the soldiers, this is because of like sort of Pope propaganda, or were they just coming from their individual kings or lords who were calling on them, or like how does Europe sort of galvanize itself to continue sustaining itself, continue sustaining the Crusaders or the Crusader state at this point with soldiers?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a mixture of everything you said. One of the things that's fueling this is if I go to Jerusalem and I fight Muslims and I kill Jews, I will go to heaven because that's what Jesus wants. And so there was this constant religious fervor driving this. And you can remember that there are now Knights Templars and Knights Hospitallers. And, the Hospitallers, they were named that because they were going to create hospitality for the tourists coming to go to Jerusalem, the pilgrims, and the Templars for the Temple Mount. And they were monks who had swords and lances and rode horses and wore armor. And, they would wear a white tunic with a big red cross on the front and back. They swore vows of chastity and they swore vows of poverty, and they were filthy rich rapists. And they would just go along the countryside massacring people in Jesus' name. And, it's like the epitome of religious fervor. Oh, I'm all about Jesus. And then I'm going to just murder everybody and rape everybody and steal money. And they were amazing soldiers. They were fanatic. They were well armored. They were well trained. They were feared by everybody because they were such good soldiers.
Okay, so I mean, we can get to Salahuddin now, but really, what gives rise to? I mean, I'm assuming he's not the first Muslim general or Muslim king or Muslim ruler who tries to organize fighting back against the Crusaders. I'm sure there's a few. Why does he succeed, and what kind of gives rise to that kind of environment that he succeeds in?
Yeah, so the resistance actually really started in Aleppo and in Damascus. The Crusaders wanted both cities desperately. The Crusaders knew if they could take Aleppo or Damascus or both, the resistance against them was probably finished, at least in Syria. And so they had tried multiple times, and the rulers in Aleppo and Damascus, worked against the Crusaders. Usually, sometimes they sided with the Crusaders against each other, because Aleppo and Damascus also feared that the other city was going to try and take it out. So, there's actually a battle early on where it's the leadership of Aleppo with the Crusaders against the leadership of Damascus and the Crusaders. And so the Crusaders are fighting Crusaders and Arabs are fighting Arabs, and it's just a mess. What happens in a lot of those early leadership situations is just as soon as you start to see a leader maybe getting his act together, he dies. And you're like, wow, that was unfortunate. Interestingly enough, there was actually also a little bit of resistance that started with the Crusaders themselves. So the daughter of Baldwin II, her name was Alice. So this is fairly early on, right? Because it goes Godfrey, Baldwin I, Baldwin II. Alice ends up in marrying the Prince of Antioch, and everybody has high expectations. Bohemond II, everybody has high expectations for him, and he gets killed in battle. And so all of a sudden, Alice is in a position where she's in charge of Antioch, but she's going to have to marry somebody, or they're just going to take Antioch away from her. And she decides, screw everybody. I'm going to side with the local Christians. She's a Crusader, right? But she's not going to side with the Catholics. She'll side with the Maronite Catholics, but not the Catholics from Western Europe. And she's going to side with the Orthodox Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews. And she's going to lead a rebellion of the city of Antioch against her own father, because Baldwin actually brings an army to Antioch to put his daughter down. In the end, she's defeated. And then Baldwin, her father, dies. Her sister takes over, Melisenda. But, of course, women couldn't rule. So she's married to a guy named Fulk. Fulk becomes the king. Alice decides, I'm going to do another rebellion. And she does a second rebellion. And Fulk brings an army up, and he defeats her. She's actually talking to Zengi and trying to figure out if Zengi will side with her. And Zengi was seriously thinking about doing it. I haven't introduced Zengi yet. Yes. I'll explain him in a second. But there's actually a movement even within the Crusaders against this. She's defeated a second time. She retreats to Latakia and Jabala, and she rules those two cities for 20 more years as a fifth Crusader state, but a Crusader state that tolerates its Jewish and Muslim populations and was effectively a rebel state. At one point, she actually led a third rebellion, but this time didn't get directly involved. But she talked Antioch into Tripoli into rebelling against the king. So Zengi. So Zengi he's kind of a complicated character, and I know we don't want to go too far into the weeds with him. He starts off in Iraq and ends up in Syria. He gets in trouble at one point. A Kurdish leader named Ayub saves him, and so Ayub basically becomes Zengi's best friend ever. Years later, Ayub gets in trouble, and Zengi brings him. Anyway, long story short, Zengi ends up in charge of Aleppo, and his goal the whole time is to try and take Damascus. He has Mosul and Aleppo, and he creates a stable state that basically is northern Iraq and a swath of land that goes through northern Syria to Aleppo, and that becomes the core of resistance against the Crusaders. I'm pretty sure he actually did help Alice, but not in a large scale. Like he was helping her in a small way. So he's looking for opportunities. He's trying to get Damascus. He wants to take it peacefully, but he had a flaw. And the flaw that he had was a character flaw. He was an alcoholic. He's a Muslim, but he drank. He liked to fight. He was a brawler. He didn't pray much. Like, he wasn't a religious guy in that sense. He really just wanted to fight, and he wanted to fight for Muslims. He just didn't want to spend a lot of time being a good Muslim. And it gets him killed in the end. He wakes up in the middle of the night and finds he had a Crusader slave. He found his Crusader slave drinking wine from his chalice. And he wakes up, looks at him, and says, "I'm going to deal with you in the morning," and turns around and goes back to bed. So the Crusader slave stabs him to death and flees. And, of course, goes back to the Crusader states as a hero for killing the one guy who looked like he was capable of fighting the Crusaders. He's replaced by his son, Nur-ad-Din, by both his sons. One son takes Mosul, and the other son takes Aleppo. Nur-ad-Din is the guy who takes Aleppo. And Nur-ad-Din is the opposite of his father. He has good posture, he's skinny, he doesn't overeat, he doesn't drink, he prays 5 times a day. His clothing is always pressed and cleaned, he's very proper. He's a great warrior in and of his own right, but he leads a very different life than his father, and he goes out of his way to sort of have that propaganda spread. Like, Nur-ad-Din is the example of what we want. He'll win because he's such a good Muslim. And he will stabilize the state and ultimately capture Damascus. And once that happens, I should tell you how he captured it. So first, they capture Edessa. So Edessa is the first Crusader state, and it's the first Crusader state to fall. When they capture Edessa, the Crusaders call for a second crusade. And they launch another army from Western Europe to go to the Middle East to save the Crusader states from being destroyed. They pass Aleppo. The crazy thing is there was nothing Nur-ad-Din could have done probably to stop them from capturing Aleppo. They outnumbered him. They pass Aleppo because they want to go to Jerusalem and then start the Second Crusade from Jerusalem. They get to Jerusalem, and now they need to figure out what to do next. The obvious thing to do is to go back to Aleppo and not go to Damascus. Damascus is a lot closer, but Damascus had made a deal with the Crusaders. Officially, the Muslim rulers of Damascus were allied with the Christian rulers of Jerusalem. So in that scenario, you want to go to Aleppo and defeat the guy who's the enemy of your friend. So what do? They attack Damascus. They attack their ally. Nur-ad-Din can't believe the gift he's just been given, because now Mu'in-ad-Din is the ruler of Damascus. Mu'in-ad-Din has no choice but to beg Nur-ad-Din for help. And so Nur-ad-Din comes down. He calls on his brother from Mosul. His brother sends his army. They stop the city from falling to the Crusaders, but they make a deal with Mu'in-ad-Din that will eventually give them the city through peace. They won't even have to fight for it. And once that happens, then there's a really powerful Crusader state under Nur-ad-Din's rule.
You mean not Crusader state, anti-Crusader state?
Sorry, there's a really powerful anti-Crusader state under Nur-ad-Din's rule. And they no longer have to deal with Damascus being an ally of the Crusaders. And Nur-ad-Din is smart enough to keep moving the court back and forth between Aleppo and Damascus, and he keeps both cities functioning. And he's also working on reaching out to other Crusaders to see where he can split, because he knows that there's some dissatisfaction going on. For the record, too, there's a fun anecdote in all of this that about Nur-ad-Din. Edessa, after they capture it, actually goes back into a state of rebellion. And Nur-ad-Din is forced to go retake Edessa because the Crusaders managed to retake it. When he does that, he realizes it's just a matter of time before there's another rebellion, that the city it's too hard to control because the Crusaders really just want it. So instead of doing what you would, typically do, which would be leave a large garrison, he decided he was going to, in addition to leaving a garrison, bring in a group of people he knew he could trust. And he went, I'm going to bring in Jews. He knew he could trust the Jewish population blindly. He knew they would be loyal to him no matter what happened. Not Turks. He's a Turk. Not Sunni Turks. He's a Sunni. He brings in Jews because he knows he doesn't have to worry about them at some point plotting against him or backstabbing him. They will be there for him. And the city never rebels again. And so, it may be that there was not going to be another rebellion, but it could also just be that the Jewish population helped keep the city from rebelling. And it just shows you how these dividing lines that we think are so profound today really were never as clear in the past as they are today. And they're probably not clear today, too. I think most of it's in our imagination.
Okay, so how does Salahuddin come on the scene?
All right. So, Amalric is the king of Jerusalem, and he takes over from Baldwin III. So, what does that make him? 4 or 5? Is he the fifth or sixth Crusader king? And Amalric gets the Crusaders had just captured Ascalon a few years earlier, and Ascalon, the Crusaders believed, was necessary to own if they were ever going to invade Egypt. And that's what Amalric wants to do. He wants to conquer Egypt. Okay, so in 11...
Just before we move on, so Ashkelon is this place just outside of Gaza, currently called Ashkelon, right?
Same thing. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Which is interesting because the Crusaders just really wanted Ascalon, and they kept attacking, and they finally get it. And they became obsessed with it in a very unhealthy way. Anyway, they had captured it just a few years, I want to say it was 5 years earlier. So Amalric now believes he has the ability to invade Egypt. So in 1163, he does. He invades Egypt. He goes to the city of Bilbais. Bilbais is... The ancient Egyptians built a canal from the Nile to where Suez is today. So you could start anywhere in the Mediterranean, go through that canal, and end up in the Red Sea. And I know everybody thinks the French did it in the 1900s, or in the 1800s. They did it again. The original canal was built like 4,500 years ago. Bilbais is on that canal, and in many ways it's the city that controls it, because it was like halfway between the Nile and Suez. So he goes to Bilbais, he puts the city under siege. There is nothing that the Egyptian population can do to stop him. And it's time for the annual floods. So the Egyptians sneak out of the city and they go out to the dikes to control the floods, and they just break holes in them, and the whole area floods. And the Crusader army is in waist-deep water trying to figure out what to do. So Amalric retreats. He was defeated by the Egyptian floods. He decides to invade again the next year. What happened was the wazir of Egypt, his name was Shawar, was overthrown. He was defeated in a coup d'etat by a guy named Dirgham. And so Shawar went to Syria and begged Nuruddin for help. Nuruddin doesn't want to do it, but Ayub, the guy that saved Nuruddin's dad Zengi, his brother is a man named Shirkuh. Shirkuh is this Kurd who he was kind of short. He's overweight because he liked to eat too much. He's an alcoholic. He cussed. He loved to brawl. He was a womanizer. He was missing an eye. He lost it in a brawl. He picked a fight with a group of his own men just because he was bored one day, and he loses his eye. He's gruff. He's always angry. He's sarcastic. Nuruddin loved him. Like they were like best friends. They're complete opposites in every way. Like Shirkuh never goes to mosque. He never prays. Nuruddin is 5 times a day. It's just, there's always a smell of alcohol on Shirkuh's breath. They're opposites in every way. Best friends. Shirkuh goes to Nuruddin and goes, let me do it. I'm going to go to Egypt. I'm going to put Shawar back into power. Nuruddin says, this is insane. I don't want to risk an army for this. Shirkuh goes, I just need 2,000 men. I'm that good. And everybody knew he was militarily brilliant. He might be able to pull off a crazy invasion of Egypt with 2,000 men, so they send him. And so Shirkuh says, I need a relative to be my lieutenant. And so he goes to Ayub's son. Ayub's son happens to be Salahuddin. And he says, you're going to be my lieutenant on this expedition to Egypt. And Salahuddin goes, if you made me the king of Egypt, I don't want to go to Egypt. I want nothing to do with Egypt. And Shirkuh goes, this is an order. I'm not asking. So Salahuddin is dragged along. He's like 26 years old. And the problem is you can't get from Syria to Egypt without walking through Crusader state territory. And they can't go by sea because the Crusaders own the port cities. So they're gonna have to sneak through Crusader territory, past Crusader forts. So they have to time their march so that at night is when they're passing the Crusader forts, and they have to be really quiet. And then in the daytime, they run out through the open spaces and then camp, and then at night they sneak past the forts again. And that's what they do. It takes them like 2 weeks to get to Egypt. When they get to Cairo, is a brand new city, right? Like Cairo is the baby in the Middle East. I guess Dubai is the new baby, but for the longest time, Cairo is the baby. It was only founded in 969, right? So it's barely over 1,000 years old. It's a joke. You know what I mean? Like Egyptian cities are 4,000 years old. So having a 5,000 years old, 6,000 years old. So having Cairo be so young is so weird. Anyway, Fustat was the actual capital. It wasn't Cairo. And Fustat was the city that Amr ibn al-As had founded when he conquered Egypt, the Arab who conquered Egypt in the 7th century. And so but Cairo is just north of it. And the Fatimids were hoping to make Cairo into the new capital. They built this grand palace there, and they were moving government assets to Cairo, but it was taking time. So they get there, Dirham's army disintegrates, they have no loyalty to him. He's basically hunted down and killed, and Shawar is put back into power. Shawar had promised that he would give 1/3 of Egypt's revenue every year to Syria if they put him back into power. He gets back into power, and he tells Shirkuh, it's time for you to leave and go back to Syria. And Shirkuh goes, yeah, but I need the money you promised, and I think I should stay here so that you can give me the money every year, and then I'll have it sent back to Syria. And Shawar goes, I've actually asked King Amalric, the king of Jerusalem, to bring an army to come dig you out, and I'll just wait for you to leave. In other words, Shawar backstabs Shirkuh. Shirkuh actually ends up going into Bilbais again. Amalric puts him under siege. Long story short, neither side can win. They can't capture the city, and the city can't escape. They're running out of food. They negotiate a deal that both Amalric and Shirkuh will leave. So they do. Then, in 1167, Amalric invades Egypt again. So it's 3 years later, and his goal is to actually defeat Shawar and conquer Egypt and add Egypt to the Crusader states. I know we don't have time to go into all the details. Long story short, Shirkuh runs around Egypt. They capture Alexandria. Salahuddin is the defender in Alexandria while Shirkuh is doing raids. It's complete chaos. Alexandria is running out of food. They don't know how to hold out. And Amalric decides to make a deal with Shawar. And this new deal, Shawar is going to pay the Crusader states an annual amount of money. Shirkuh will be allowed to leave, so he leaves with Salahuddin, and Amalric will leave a garrison behind in both Cairo and Alexandria. And so in a way, Amalric wins. He makes Egypt into a vassal state. In at the end of 1168, so December of 1168, January of 1169, Shirkuh invades again. This time his goal is to liberate Egypt from Amalric's rule. Amalric does something really strange. He massacres the city of Bilbais. He kills everybody in it. And then he goes to Tanis and he murders all the Egyptians in Tanis. And then he starts marching towards Fustat, the capital. And Shawar panics. He orders everybody out of Fustat and he burns his own capital to the ground because he wants to show the Crusaders how serious he is, and he doesn't want the Crusaders to capture it. Shirkuh shows up with an army with Salahuddin at his side again, and the Coptic Church was trying to stay neutral because the Coptic Church was, worried the Crusaders might win, and then what happens to them? But also they were confused because, well, aren't the Crusaders fellow Christians? But at the same time, they had a really good relationship with the Fatimid government, so they were trying to sit on this. Once Bilbais is massacred, the Coptic Church goes over to Shirkuh and they go, we are on your side. We will back you to the end. We hate the Crusaders. We want nothing to do with them. And again, not a long story short, they capture Shawar. Salahuddin does. Salahuddin kills Shawar. They make Shirkuh the wazir. So it's 1169. I think he became wazir in February of 1169. Amalric realizes he's outmatched now because the Syrian and Egyptian armies get merged together under Shirkuh's command. And so Amalric withdraws from Egypt. Shirkuh stayed as wazir for 2 months. He dies from a throat complication. It's been suggested based on his symptoms that he had quinsy, like tonsillitis. A tonsillitis killed him. It's such a dumb death for a warrior like that. Killed by your tonsils. In any case, everybody's scrambling because who's going to replace Shirkuh? For the record, Shir means lion, Kuh means mountain. So his name was Lion Mountain. And then he took the laqab, the nickname, Asad-ad-Din, Lion of Faith. So that was his name was Lion of Faith, Lion Mountain. Such a cool name. Everybody's scrambling trying to figure out who's going to replace him. And the guy they pick is none other than 31-year-old Salahuddin. And one of the reasons they picked him was they thought he was naive and they thought he was too young and they didn't think he had a power base because he just, he was the lieutenant for Shirkuh, but he just wasn't connected to the court in Damascus the way Shirkuh was. He wasn't connected even to his own soldiers the way Shirkuh was. So they thought he'd be easy to manipulate. So they make him the wazir. And all of a sudden, Salahuddin goes from, he's somebody's aide-de-camp to he is on equal footing with Nur-ad-Din because Egypt is more powerful than Syria. Egypt had more money, it had more people, it had more resources, it had bigger trade balance. There's no reason on earth in that moment to think that Egypt isn't at least the equal. And that's how Salahuddin gets his start. Nur-ad-Din is panicked because he knew Shirkuh was loyal. They were best friends. But he doesn't really know what Salahuddin's going to be like. And so he orders Salahuddin to get rid of the Fatimids because they're Shia. And because he's the wazir, but there's still a Fatimid Khalifa. And he also orders Salahuddin to come to Damascus to basically pay homage, to show that he really is subservient to Nur-ad-Din. And Salahuddin keeps making up excuses why he can't go to Damascus and why he won't overthrow the Fatimid Khalifa. It takes Salahuddin about 2 years before he finally does overthrow the Fatimid Khalifa. And then he continually refuses to meet with Nur-ad-Din. Salahuddin does 2 military expeditions against the Crusaders, and both times Nur-ad-Din finds out about it and sends an army from Syria to go he leads an army. His goal is to meet Salahuddin in Palestine since Salahuddin won't come to Damascus. And both times Salahuddin retreats back to Egypt. And both times Nur-ad-Din goes, what did you do that for? We were going to meet up and we were going to defeat these Crusaders. And both times Salahuddin has an excuse. The first one, he said, I had to deal with a rebellion. It's true. He had to deal with a rebellion, but he could have met with Nur-ad-Din and then turned around and dealt with the rebellion. And the second time he said, my dad was sick, but he didn't find out until he got back to Egypt that his dad was sick. So that's not the reason he did it. He did it because he was worried that if he paid homage to Nur-ad-Din, it would make it real. As long as he didn't meet with him, they were kind of on equal footing. By 1174, Nur-ad-Din became convinced that Salahuddin was planning a rebellion against him and was going to break, the state that Nur-ad-Din had created. And he got an army together and he was going to march through Crusader territory to go put down Salahuddin. And just as they're about to march, he had a tonsillitis and it killed him. And Nur-ad-Din dies in 1174. So for those of you who get a sore throat, go to the doctor because apparently it's really dangerous.
Okay, give me a sense. I mean, before we talk about Salahuddin sort of consolidating power, give me a sense of how he got rid of the Fatimids. I mean, specifically, because I mean, I think we're going to now spend a bit of time speaking about him and his behavior and the kind of the legacy he leaves. And I've heard, and I personally, when I go into the history myself, I get conflicting reports over the extent of atrocity or non-atrocity when he actually dealt with the Fatimids. So just deal with that briefly. That's more to sort of scratch my own itch, right?
Right.
But then also, how does he then consolidate power and sort of change the dynamics? Because it's not like he just marches on Jerusalem. There's a change in the dynamics of power and how the states kind of look at each other for that period just before he does. So yeah, all yours.
Yeah, so in 1171, it's a little unclear because there's conflicting reports, like you said. So I'm going to go with what I think makes the most sense based on everything else. It looks to me like Salahuddin actually had the last Fatimid Khalifa poisoned. And as the man is slowly dying, because apparently they didn't give him a particularly nasty, lethal dose. They gave him a poison that would kill him slowly. As he was slowly dying, he kept begging to meet with Salahuddin. And, Salahuddin had been his wazir for 2 years at that point. And the man was young. I want to say he was 21, maybe? He might have been 20. And so he keeps asking for Salahuddin. It takes him about 2 weeks to die. Salahuddin never met with him. And later on, Salahuddin said that was one of his biggest regrets. So to me, it's unclear. Was his big regret that he poisoned him, or was it his big regret that he didn't meet with him, or was it both? But it turns out that all the Khalifa wanted was for Salahuddin to promise to take care of his children. So the fact that Salahuddin doesn't meet with him is kind of, you could see how that would bother him a little bit. So Salahuddin definitely did some brutal stuff from time to time. It looks like he's the guy who killed Shawar. It looks like he's the guy who killed the last Fatimid Khalifa. It's not, he's not always this good guy that I think we always try to make him out to be, especially in his early years. There is an uprising of Mamluk. Mamluk means owned. And so there was in addition to Turkish, Kurdish, and Arab free soldiers, there was also an army a slave army. And that slave army basically was, you were captured in battle, you were offered the opportunity to convert to Islam and become a Mamluk. So that army would have had blue-eyed blonde Normans running around with names like Roger, and it would have had, blacks from Nubia who had been enslaved and brought into that army, and Arab slaves and Turkish slaves and Kurdish slaves. Like, it would have been the ultimate cosmopolitan army of slaves. And there was a slave uprising, and Salahuddin put it down, and he was rather ruthless with it. And that uprising, apparently the units were primarily Nubian, so they were primarily black. So I think a frequent name for the thing is like the Black Uprising or the Black Rebellion. In any case, Salahuddin, when Nur-ad-Din dies, Salahuddin has a really interesting set of options, because right after Nur-ad-Din dies, Amalric dies, the king of Jerusalem. I think it was 2 months later. And when Amalric dies, by the way, he died of dysentery. So just be really careful with your gut. Your gut will kill you, it turns out, whether it's the top or the bottom. Amalric dies, and so there's now chaos in the kingdom of Jerusalem. There's chaos in Syria. There's no leadership in either country. Both places are trying to figure out what's next. And Salahuddin needs to make a choice. His first option is attack the kingdom of Jerusalem right now while it's reeling from the death of its king. His second option would be to attack Syria and try and annex it. But he realizes if he attacks Syria, then he looks like the villain. So he doesn't want to attack it. And he's worried that if he attacks the kingdom of Jerusalem while Syria is not stable, he won't have support from the north. For all he knows, the Syrians will side with the kingdom of Jerusalem against him. So he decides to do nothing. And he actually sits on it. There was a Turkish general who was in charge of Aleppo, he runs to Damascus. He captures in Damascus the son of Nuruddin and brings him by force back to Aleppo and says, I'm the guy in charge, I'm his regent, I'm in charge of figuring this kid's future out. And then he takes an army back to Damascus a few weeks later to capture the city. So the military commander in Damascus sends word to Salahuddin and says, I'm begging you to come stop the siege and save our city. And so Salahuddin takes a very small force. They sneak through Crusader territory. They arrive in Damascus. It's enough to scare away the Atabeg of Aleppo. They enter the city, and there's confusion because the guy who's in control of the citadel doesn't immediately hand over the city. At that point, Salahuddin's brother climbs the wall and then sticks Salahuddin's banner on the citadel wall. And so everybody goes, wait, did we capture the citadel? And in the confusion, the gates open and Salahuddin marches in, and he captures Damascus without any bloodshed. And in that moment, then he's seen as the liberator of Syria as opposed to the guy who attacks it. So it was genius waiting for somebody to basically beg him to come. Once that happens, then every step he takes afterwards is to try and get Aleppo. Because once he has Aleppo, he knows he'll have the Crusader state surrounded on both sides. And he's working towards that. It takes him quite a few years. By 1180, he has Aleppo, but also he does something really interesting. There's a new king. The new king was Baldwin IV. So Baldwin IV had leprosy. He was the leper king. He became king as a teenager. By 1180, he's finally an adult, but barely. Salahuddin goes to him and says, do you want to just do peace? We could just end the war right here, right now. You guys keep Jerusalem. You keep the coast. You keep Antioch and Tripoli. You keep Jaffa, Akka, Sur, all of it. The coast is yours. But we stop fighting each other. And Baldwin IV goes, this is amazing, let's do it. They sign a peace treaty and they end the conflict. Just like that. It's done. Except it's not, obviously.
So what happens? What happens? Why? How is that? How is the treaty? Who doesn't live up to the treaty, and how is it broken?
Okay, so the basis of the treaty was anytime Christian pilgrims want to go to Jerusalem, they can. They will have safe, free passage. There's nothing. Nobody will ever mess with them. The kingdom of Jerusalem will keep Jerusalem. Everything is intact the way it is. All that has to happen is no more raids on caravans, no more attacks on cities, no attempt to expand territory. So lock down the borders right where they are. So there was a guy named Renaud de Chatillon. Renaud de Chatillon was just brutal bastard. He ends up marrying Alice's daughter, Constance, and becomes the Prince of Antioch. At one point, he decides he's really bored just being the Prince of Antioch. He invades and conquers and massacres, pillages, and plunders Cyprus. Cyprus belonged to the Roman Empire. On paper, the Principality of Antioch belongs to the Roman Empire. So one Roman province just attacked another Roman province and sacked it. He ends up laying on his belly, begging the Roman emperor not to punish him. The Roman emperor decides to forgive him. I wouldn't have, but the Roman emperor forgives him. And he continues to do stuff, crazy stuff. Ultimately, he gets captured and gets imprisoned by Nuruddin. He's in prison in Aleppo. And by the way, Nuruddin captured a bunch of Crusader rulers. He captured Raymond III, Bohemond III. He captured Jocelyn III. Like, he has all these Crusaders in prison in Aleppo. It's like this giant... almost the entire Crusader leadership is in Aleppo at one point in prison. When Nuruddin dies, the Turkish Atabeg of Aleppo is desperate for funding, and 1176 sells Renaud de Chatillon back to the Crusader states. And I don't remember the sum of money, but it was a significant sum. It's not enough for him to survive. Salahuddin eventually takes over Aleppo, and the guy is ultimately killed. But Renaud de Chatillon then is given Kerak in what is today Jordan. And Renaud de Chatillon refuses to let the peace sink in. So Renaud de Chatillon is the mastermind of the Battle of Montquisade. 1 year after he's freed from prison, he had been in prison for almost 2 decades. 1 year afterwards, he leads the Crusader army against Salahuddin, and they beat the Salahuddin's army like it's a catastrophe. It's a massacre. So 3 years later, when the peace happens, he's like, no, I'm not doing this. And he begins raiding. And he's attacking caravans. He's attacking pilgrims heading to Mecca. And then he decides that's not enough. He builds a fleet in Aqaba, and he attacks several forts in Egypt. And then he starts heading towards the coastal region, so Anbu area, because he's on his way. What he wants to do is land near Anbu and go all the way, am I saying Anbu? Yanbu. And then he wants to go all the way to Medina because he wants to dig up the Prophet Muhammad's bones and take them back to the Crusader states. When Salahuddin left his brother as the governor of Egypt, when he realizes what's happening, he takes the Egyptian fleet and they chase down Renaud's fleet and they capture it. They sink the fleet, they capture it, they stop this from happening. But now Salahuddin's incensed. He's like, dude, what are you doing? You were going to go dig up our prophets? Like, he can't imagine it. And it breaks his mind. And he basically, at that point, begins to operate under the assumption that the treaty is over. And he puts Kerak under siege. Baldwin IV shows up, and he begs Salahuddin to let him punish Renaud de Chatillon. And ultimately, Salahuddin says, okay, fine, we'll put the peace treaty back in, but Renaud has to stop. And he won't. He continues to attack caravans. And so eventually by 1187, Salahuddin believes there's no option, but he has to put down the Kingdom of Jerusalem. For 7 years, he tried to make peace work. And it just wasn't going to happen. Renaud wasn't going to allow it.
Okay, so just, I mean, we don't have enough time, but I mean, I think we need to speak about the Battle of Hattin just for a while before we speak about the actual fall of Jerusalem. I mean, we can be very brief about it, but just what happens next? So how does this battle come about, and how does that sort of culminate in Jerusalem going back to, you know, the former sort of Muslim / Arab / not Crusader empire?
Yeah, so Salahuddin decides that he needs to lure the Crusader army into a trap. And what he does is he attacks Tiberias. It's on the Sea of Galilee. And Tiberias, the city was through marriage owned by Raymond III, who was the Count of Tripoli. And the goal then is capture Tiberias and draw the Crusader army to Galilee to fight. When this happens, Raymond III goes to the Crusader king, who's now a guy named Guy de Lusignan. And the reason it's Guy is because Baldwin IV finally dies from the leprosy. It killed him. And so his sister had married this idiot named Guy. And so now King Guy, which is a hard thing to say without cracking a smile, is taking the Crusader army to Tiberias to recapture it. And Raymond III is like, don't do this. This is stupid. This is Salahuddin set up a trap. I don't mind that I've lost Tiberias. Let him have it. We don't need to do this. And Guy's like, I hate you so much. I want to attack and fall into a trap just to not do what you're telling me to do. So that's the level of petty these guys were operating at. And so they go to Hattin. So the Sea of Galilee is actually a lake, freshwater lake. And what Salahuddin had done was he had messed up one of the watering holes that the Crusaders were going to use. And so it was producing very little water. So they went from one watering hole to this one that they had been planning on using that didn't have enough water. And then their only option was to either turn around or get to the Sea of Galilee and basically drink from this lake because they're running out of water. And Salahuddin parks his army in, there's these two ancient volcanoes. They look like horns sticking up in the air. He parks it in between so that the Crusader army has to fight their way through these horns to get to the other side. Raymond takes his army plus the army that was brought in by Antioch, and they go charging in. They fight their way through Salahuddin's army. They reach the lake, they get their fresh water, and then they turn and they run as fast as they can, and they get back to Lebanon. They abandon the Crusader army completely. So Raymond III was like, we shouldn't fight this, it's a trap, and he flees. The rest of the army spends the whole day trying to get to the Sea of Galilee. They just can't do it. At one point, the men start climbing up onto the horns because they just don't know what else to do. And so King Guy has to run around trying to get the men off the horns so they'll fight. And eventually they have to surrender. And it was a catastrophic event because the Crusader army, the vast majority of it is now under Salahuddin's possession. The king and a bunch of the leadership. Balian of Ibelin had escaped. And I said Raymond III escaped. Raymond, the son of Bohemond III of Antioch, escaped. So there's some guys that got away, but the majority were captured. And then that's where, including Renaud de Chatillon, that's where there's the famous moment where Salahuddin offers a glass of ice water to Guy de Lusignan, and Guy takes his drink and then starts to offer it to Raymond, and Salahuddin knocks it out of his hand and says, I didn't offer it to him. And then he draws his sword and kills Renaud right there. He stabs him. And what was customary is if you offered a prisoner water, it was your way of saying, I will spare you, I won't kill you. That's why it was so important for Salahuddin to knock the water out of his hand. But of course, Guy thinks he's next, and then Salahuddin has to explain, no, you already drank water, I'm not going to kill you. And then he says, kings don't kill kings. And then, of course, Guy's marveling at the fact that they have ice water in August, and he can't figure out how they have ice. There's this thing called mountains, and the ice is on the top of them. Anyway. At that point, then, Salahuddin has to make a serious set of choices. So if you look at some of the choices Salahuddin had made up until that point, there are moments where he was not very merciful. In this moment, he suddenly becomes extremely merciful. And he has to negotiate with his army. His army wants to massacre the entire Crusader army. He's like, no, I don't want to do this. I think this would be a terrible idea. They compromise. They're gonna massacre the Templars, the Hospitallers, not the commander of the Templars, by the way, but everybody else. Salahuddin refuses to massacre the commander. And then the Turcopoles. So the Turcopoles were horse archers who fought in the Arab style, but fought for the Crusaders. And Salahuddin hated that because he was halfway convinced that many of those men were actually Muslims who had converted to Christianity. And so he saw them as traitors. So he wanted them killed, but he didn't want the Templars and Hospitallers killed. So what he did was he had his men who spoke Latin run over to the Hospitallers and Templars and start telling them, if you convert to Islam, we won't execute you. And so a group of them, 10, 15, 20% of them actually convert. They had been religious fanatics up until that moment, and suddenly they realized, nope, they were Muslims in their heart, and they convert and become Mamluk and save their lives. I think what happened was the following. I think Salahuddin realized that the only way to get the Crusaders to stop was to keep showing them mercy. That the violence of defeat would set off another crusade. That if you kept beating them and being rough with them, the trauma would heap on top of the trauma, and they would keep doing this. But if you were merciful and tried to free as many as possible, it would erode away at their trauma, and little by little they would start to calm down. And so his strategy from that point on, from 1187 to his death in 1193, was to every chance he got, just be merciful and avoid being brutal.
Okay, so how does he eventually take Jerusalem?
So he goes to Jerusalem. The Crusader army is destroyed, right? He possesses it. they're under his control. So there's a garrison in Jerusalem. And when he gets there, he puts the city under siege. Balian of Ibelin shows up. And Balian's there with a few knights. And Balian goes up to Salahuddin and he says, I have a problem. My wife and my children are inside Jerusalem. And I'd like to get them out before you fight and take the city. So Salahuddin goes, okay, fine. And he lets Balian go in. Balian goes in, and then he comes back out, and he says, with his family, with his wife, I think he had 2 kids, 2 sons and 2 daughters. He comes out with his 4 kids and his wife, and he says, by the way, his wife was the previous queen of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, just to put that in perspective. So his stepdaughter, Isabella, is actually one of the heirs to the king. So we're not talking about some random dude. Like in the movie The Kingdom of Heaven, he's some random guy who comes from Germany or France or something. In reality, he was born and raised in the Crusader states and was one of the largest landholders and married the former queen. Like he was, it's such a different, the reality is so different from the movie. When he comes back out with his family, he says to Salahuddin, I have another problem and I'd like permission to solve it. And Salahuddin goes, what is it? And he goes, there's no leadership in Jerusalem and they're begging me to go take command of the city. And Salahuddin goes, fine, go ahead. And then at that point, Balian says, no, I have one more problem. Can you escort my family to Tyre so that I know that they're safe? And Salahuddin goes, fine, I'll have your family safely delivered. And so Balian goes in, takes command of the city, and it's a brutal siege. Salahuddin is hammering it with trebuchets. They carve a hole in the wall. They fight for the city. And in the end, Balian and Salahuddin go into negotiations. And Balian famously says, I will destroy every holy relic in the city. I will kill every person living in the city. Because there were some Muslims living in the city. There were no Jews, but there were definitely Muslims living in the city. And I will make it so that the city has no value to anybody. And Salahuddin's like, I'm pretty sure I don't want that to be the outcome. But then Salahuddin says, what if we just free everybody? I just let you guys go. And we just go ahead and make a deal where Christians can come here anytime they want. They can live here. They can come visit. And we can just peacefully coexist. And Balian's shocked because he didn't expect this. Salahuddin ends up having to argue with his army because his army wants to enslave all of the Crusaders. They come up with a number. Long story short, they actually buy the freedom of most of the Crusaders, and a few thousand are enslaved in the end because they just didn't have enough money to free them. And interestingly enough, some of the rich Crusaders had the money. They could have bought their fellow Crusaders freedom, and they just refused to spend their coin to do it. And so there was actually a lot of bitterness between Crusaders because they couldn't believe that they were doing this. Because Salahuddin actually emptied his own personal coffers and bought a bunch of Crusaders and freed them. His brother at one point said, I need 3,000 Crusader slaves for a project I'm working on in Egypt. So they gave him the 3,000 slaves, and then he immediately freed them. And so they didn't go to Egypt. They just were freed instantly. And the reason why they wanted to free the Crusaders was Salahuddin became convinced that mercy was the path to a long-lasting peace. It's a disaster because all these Crusaders that they keep freeing keep going to Tyre, and they're slowly but surely reforming a resistance movement to fight against Salahuddin. And the Third Crusade is called for, and the next thing you know, Salahuddin is fighting all over again, and a massive army comes from Europe, and there's the remnants of the army he's freed in Palestine. And so there are a lot of people who criticized Salahuddin at the time and have criticized him since, saying mercy clearly didn't work because now you have to fight them all over again. But Salahuddin's argument was, Zengi didn't show the kind of mercy I did. Nuruddin didn't show the kind of mercy I did. I'm the one who captured Jerusalem. I'm the one who created a lasting peace. And so, you can look at it both ways, but it's interesting because he, whether we like it or not, he's right. He is the one who, in the end, pulled it off. And And whether you think his strategy of mercy was right or wrong, 3 years after the treaty he signs with Richard the Lionheart lasts 3 years, and 2 of those years were after he died. So even with him not being there, he still created at least a short peaceful period.
Okay, so I mean, we kind of fast forward very quickly there to Richard the Lionheart, which makes a lot of sense. And I'm not going to ask you to go and sort of talk about all those things that happened in the Third Crusade, because then we'll be here for much longer. But just once sort of Salahuddin passes away, what kind of new status quo comes into existence for that period? And why do the popes stop calling for more crusades and more reinforcements? Is it just fatigue? Is it sort of the peace that Salahuddin created sort of created a sociological idea in Europe that they shouldn't be just going there all the time? How do the crusades stop essentially?
So the Pope does call for a Fourth Crusade. The Fourth Crusade doesn't make it. It was led by a Venetian named Enrico Dandolo, and they actually went with the Venetian fleet. And Enrico Dandolo captured a city in what is today Croatia, and that pissed off the Pope so badly that he excommunicated Enrico Dandolo. So the leader of the Fourth Crusade is excommunicated from the church. Dandolo takes the expedition to Constantinople. They're led into the city, and they decide that's it. They're where they need to be. They launch a coup d'etat. They overthrow the Roman emperor. They replace the Roman emperor with this Catholic guy, and they create a new Roman state that's Catholic. And the remnants of the Roman Empire end up in Anatolia. So there's now a Roman Empire in Anatolia, a Roman Empire in Thrace, and then there's the Holy Roman Empire. So there were 3 places that called themselves a Roman Empire. And it's a disaster, I think, by anybody's standards. By the way, Enrico Dandolo was blind. So he's this blind excommunicated guy who leads this coup d'etat. And he basically makes the Roman Empire into a vassal state of the Venetian state. When Salahuddin makes the peace treaty with Richard the Lionheart, the deal is that Antioch, Tripoli, Beirut, Tyre, Sidon, that whole stretch of coast, Akka, will remain underneath Crusader rule. And so they'll have the port cities, basically, but the interior will be in Salahuddin's Ayyubid state. And then whenever anybody wants to, they can go to Jerusalem. And so I think at some level there was Crusader fatigue. I think the fact that the Fourth Crusade had been misdirected and ended up in Constantinople, that was added to the Crusader fatigue. And I think the enthusiasm just sort of fell apart. But I also think they were missing the kind of soldiers that they had in the beginning. That surge of excess Norman, Viking conversion to Christianity. That population of people just weren't there anymore. And it's generations later. Also, I think a lot of the Crusaders had become a little bit nativized, and they didn't quite see themselves like when we were talking about the Second Crusade and they're trying to capture Damascus. There was one of the reasons why Damascus failed is Nuruddin successfully pitted the native Crusaders apart from the recent invader Crusaders and got them paranoid about each other, and they turned on each other. And so I think there was a little bit of that as well, like that there was this understanding that somehow the Crusaders who had been living there weren't quite pure Christian anymore. They'd been too influenced by Muslims and Jews, and they had been too influenced by Arab culture. Another thing that was also happening was the Crusaders, as they returned to Europe, were bringing back all that Arab technology. Arabs had invented water wheels, and they brought that back. The Persians had invented modern medicine, and they were bringing that back. And I think there's sort of a little bit of a surge of prosperity in the birth of the Renaissance. And I think it made it so that a lot of people were thinking, you know what's better than warfare? Let's trade. And you know what's better than warfare? wine and luxury goods and all these things we can purchase from the Middle East. And I think a lot of that, there was a shift there. Another thing that happened was Sicily. So Roger II and Frederick II, two of the leaders of Sicily, they were Catholic, they were European, but they had this concept of tolerance. So if you find coins from the time period, one side is struck in Latin, the other side is struck in Arabic. The courts were a mixture of Muslims and Jews and Catholics. Al-Idris, the map maker, he was working for Roger II in Sicily. He was working for a Christian ruler. That was his patron. Roger II and Frederick II both were polyglots, and they spoke 6 different languages, one of them being Arabic, and they were reading Arabic texts and translating them into Latin. Frederick II got into falconry, and he was running around dressed like an Arab, having falcons land on his arm, and he got excommunicated by the Pope twice, and he was a Renaissance man who was learning science. And in other words, I think what started to happen was there was this shift of hating and not understanding the Middle East and hating Arabs and hating Muslims to admiring Muslims and wanting to bring in more technology and more culture and philosophy and poetry, to the point where people started doing fashions. Like women, if you look at women in the medieval period, they started covering their hair in Europe because they were imitating the women in the Middle East. And in other words, the Crusades sort of led to this new cultural renaissance in Europe that literally is the Renaissance. And I think that also helped to stave off another crusade from reaching the Middle East. I think 9 were called for all total, but only the first 3 actually got to the Middle East.
Okay, so I'm going to fast forward a bunch, and then we're going to end up where World War I is, right? Just because we haven't. I would love to, and I can. Every time you answer a question, your face lights up, and it's fantastic. But we are going to run out of time. So I mean, a lot of things happen from that period until 1900. I'm just briefly going to go through them. So in the sort of the Muslim part of the world, the Mongol invasions devastated. Baghdad falls. And that eventually gives rise to the Ottoman Empire that's consolidated. But a lot more things happen in Europe. The Renaissance, which is eventually leads to colonialism and sort of, again, European identity, maybe not to some extent Christian identity, but it's a bit different, is weaponized in these colonial endeavors, right? A lot of Muslim former lands, not all of them, fall to colonialism. And then in World War I, when the Ottoman Empire is vanquished, Britain kind of take over what is now Palestine, what's called Palestine now, and Britain and France take over Syria, and these were kind of like the lands where the Crusader states were. I'm going to ask you a question now, and I just want to get your temperature on it. In a way, what do you agree with and what do you disagree with looking at that moment in 1919 and European colonialism taking root or creating damage, because it doesn't take root then essentially? How do you see that? Is it fair to call that like a fifth crusade, or is this a break and something different?
Oh, I definitely think it is another crusade, in part because they saw it that way. I'm trying to remember the name of the French general. Gouraud is the name in my head, but I'm probably wrong. So when the French, there's a battle called the Battle of Maysalun in 1920. So after the treaties in Europe that end World War I are done, it's decided that they're going to basically do Sykes-Picot and carve up the Middle East and give pieces to France and Britain. Now, originally Sykes-Picot was going to give Iraq to France because Britain was going to get southern Iran and Russia was going to get northern Iran, but Russia goes communist, so they don't want to invade Iran. So the British consolation prize for not getting southern Iran is to get Iraq. But now the French are going to get Syria. So the French invade, they fight the Battle of Maysalun, the Syrian army is defeated. King Faisal had tried to make a Arab state that would include the Hejaz Mountains, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, Palestine, and he wanted to make a single state in that land, and he's defeated. He made his capital Damascus. He's defeated, and so that's over. The French general, and Gouraud is the name in my head, but it's probably wrong, goes to Salahuddin's tomb, kicks it, and says, "Saladin, we're back," which tells me all I need to know whether or not that was another crusade or not. I mean, in their mind, it was another crusade, which is what makes it one. The British wanted Palestine because they wanted to be the guys who had Jerusalem. This was, King Richard the Lionheart never retook Jerusalem. That was his dream, and he dies having not done it. And I think that this, in the mind of the English, they had done it. They had fulfilled Richard's goal, and they took Jerusalem. The English actually resisted the creation of Israel in part because I think they saw this as the undoing of their success. They were also determined not to let the Palestinian state form because, the UN had partitioned Palestine between Israel and Palestine. They succeeded in one and failed in the other. But I do think they definitely saw it as a crusade.
Now, of course, there's this massive genocide that's been raging for 19 months, and that before that there was 75 years of occupation by Israel of the region, and many critiques of Israel. They see this as sort of an extension of the colonial settler project. They also see the unabashed sort of support that the West and Western powers, Europe and the USA, give to Israel. They see this kind of also from the lens of trying to extend what was once like an extension of Europe. In which way do you see that playing out? And do you think that's fair, or at which stage is this a case of just its new sort of Israeli identity, which is very different to Jewish identity historically in the region? Or do you see it just as this is a settler colonial state that's been imposed on the region from Europe, or do you which way is that interplaying that and sort of the indigenousness? I wouldn't say indigenousness, that's the wrong word maybe, but sort of the organic momentum of Zionism itself?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, one question to ask is, does Israel participate in Eurovision? And then another question is, when Israel plays soccer matches, football matches, who are they playing against again? So it is obvious that it is a settler colonial project. The Ashkenazi are the leadership of it, and the Ashkenazi are, of course, Jewish Europeans. So at its heart, it is a European settler colonial project. Now, it's complicated and it's messy because I think one of the things that's really fascinating to me is, if you're anti-Zionist, you're anti-Semite is the charge that everybody keeps throwing. And of course, the reality is there's no correlation between the two. They're completely unrelated, to the point where I guarantee you that the majority of American Zionists are anti-Semitic, that their support for Zionism is because they don't want Jews living in Europe and the United States, and they figure if there's an Israel, then the Jews are living in the Middle East, not in Europe and not the United States. And they also see it as an extra win because then those Jews are killing Semites, because Palestinians are Semitic. And so it's like a double win. It's like Hitler's wet dream. He just, I got rid of the Jews from Europe and they're killing Semites. How could it be any better? And so at some level, there's this, it's not like it's the English coming and massacring a native population of, Cherokee and Ojibwa and replacing them with the settler. They've ejected the unwanted part of Europe into the Middle East. And so in a strange way, the Israelis are kind of victims in this. They've accepted their victimization, but in a way they're fulfilling the anti-Semitic goals of Europe and the anti-Semitic goals of the United States. Having said that, their dream is to become Middle Easterners, and they want to eat falafel and couscous, and they want to have music that sounds like it's organically from the Middle East. And they've banned, or at least severely discouraged, the Jewish languages like Ladino and Yiddish from being spoken because they want it to be Hebrew, because they think that makes them more organically and more authentically Middle Eastern, even though, for all intents and purposes, Ladino is an organic Middle Eastern language. Obviously, Yiddish is related to Slavic and German, but they're in a way, in a really strange way, they're rejecting their own Europeanness at some level to be as authentically Middle Eastern as they can be. And that's the Ashkenazi population. Then there's the Eastern Jews or the Mizrahi Jews, and then there's the Sephardic Jews that have been brought along, the Jewish Ethiopians and the Jewish Chinese and the Jewish Indians who have sort of been pulled into this, the Jewish Persians who have been sucked into this thing that have sort of gone along, and they're treated like second and third class citizens. They don't have the same kind of status as Ashkenazi, and so you see the sort of traditional European style racism superimposed within Israeli society, which then, of course, makes me go, oh my God, it's really, truly like a South African-style apartheid system where, the whites are on the top, the Asians are in the middle, the coloreds, and then the blacks at the bottom. And it's structured in such a similar way. And, of course, in this case, the Palestinians are the blacks, and the Jewish Ethiopians who are actually black would be the third class, and they'd be the coloreds. And so in so many ways, they've recreated all of the worst of Europe and European civilization, while at the same time still being this population of people that Europe literally pogromed for 850 years, ultimately resulting in the pogrom of pogroms, the Holocaust. And the European solution was, why don't you go live in Palestine? If the Europeans wanted to create a just resolution, they would have ethnically cleansed and genocided Austria and called it Israel and given Austria to the Jewish population and said, this should be yours. After all, Hitler was Austrian. But that wasn't the end goal. The goal was never to create a just outcome. The goal was to somehow export the population out of Europe. And then in the process, hurt another brown population.
Okay, so this is going to be like, not really questions, but it's my final prompt, but there may be some follow-ups, right? So earlier on, you spoke about how sort of the Crusades culminated to an end, really, because there wasn't enough sort of momentum behind them, because there was trade, because there was cultural ideas and exchanges and everything else. There also has been, and it's not a new thing, it's not just since sort of the war on terror, but there's been historically lots of anti-Muslim sentiment and also anti-European sentiment from Muslim and Arab populations. Lots of literature, lots of myths being built about Mohammedans and people in the region. So there's that element, and I think we need to talk about that. But then also, earlier on, before we actually started the recording, I mentioned that in many ways, maybe if what happens after World War I is the Fifth Crusade, then the war on terror is the Sixth Crusade, right? So just how do we, and all of this, and again, I also mentioned earlier in our conversation the clash of civilizations, and that we all know the book by Samuel Huntington, which kind of I wouldn't say is the first time that phrase is expressed, but it's really re-put that kind of clash on the map. And given what's happening in Gaza right now, and given what happened in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the consistent bogeyman of Iran, there is definitely there's definitely people trying to make this clash come into existence, and then of course there's lots of exchange of ideas, and there's lots of multiculturalism, and many more people are eating falafel in New York and London and hummus than they ever have, right? So there's the same interplay going on. How do you think we kind of, firstly, your thoughts on sort of the negative elements of the legacy of the Crusade, the clash elements, but also how do we move? And of course you don't have the answer to with this, but what's your thoughts on how we move beyond that? And do you think we're going to be able to, or how is it going to unravel?
This is a great question because it is such a seriously strange problem. The Israelis had a problem in the 50s and 60s because they needed to justify what they were doing, which was ethnic cleansing and sort of low-grade genocide, right? It wasn't the kind of murder that we've seen over the last 19 months, but there was definitely murder, mass incarceration, and land confiscation, destruction of economy, like low-grade, slow-creep genocide. And so it was hard to justify. Think about it. It's the 1950s and 60s. late 40s, and you're doing this to a population of people in the aftermath of World War II, where the world had this new sense of maybe genocide isn't great. Maybe this isn't the right thing to do. To make this make sense, the Israelis had to rely on two things. One was good old-fashioned racism. At the end of the day, they knew they could count on Europeans to view white lives as having more value than brown and black lives. So that wasn't a problem for them. They already had that in place. There was nothing new or interesting or strange about it. For the record, that colorism was born in Spain. And the reason it was born in Spain, right, we think of it as such a, typical UK or US way of thinking. It was actually born in Spain. And the reason it was born there was the Christians, as they were pushing the border south and defeating Muslim states and pushing until they got it down to the Kingdom of Granada and then they finished it off. They wanted to have a hierarchy of Christianness. And what they decided was that it was a genetic thing, that the browner you were, or the darker you were, the more Muslim DNA or Jewish DNA you had, and the lighter your skin was, the less Jewish and Muslim DNA you had, and the more Christian your ancestors were. And so as a result, you wanted to be as light-colored as possible, and they began using the word white to describe the lightest-colored people. And so in this really strange way, anti-Muslim feelings and anti-brown and anti-black racism are intimately intertwined in European civilization. And so the Israelis had that. They could work off that. The problem they had was that the world did start to look at this with a little bit more skepticism. Like what the British were doing in Kenya wasn't quite right anymore. People were beginning to question, should the British be doing this in Kenya? And what the French were doing in Algeria and Vietnam wasn't registering with people very well. So the Israelis added a second dimension. And the second dimension was to try to villainize Arabs and Muslims in every instance they could, in art, in literature, in movies, wherever and whenever they could. And they launched a propaganda campaign that was wildly successful that portrayed Arabs as inherently anti-Semitic, that they just hated Jews at their core. And the Israelis even did false flag terrorist attacks in places like Iraq to try and show how, look, the Arabs keep hurting us and attacking us. And it worked. It was wildly successful because at the end of the day, the American population, especially, but Europe as well, began to start to see this as a Jewish-Muslim struggle, a Jewish struggle that was for the survival of the Jewish people against this tyrannical, massive Muslim horde. And it's unfortunate because it means that there's this long-lasting legacy that's deep in U.S. culture. I'll give you a personal example, an anecdotal example. In 1991, I was a kid, but I was at a university in the United States, and I was protesting the first genocidal massacre of Iraq that the United States did. And, was it right for Iraq to invade Kuwait? Absolutely not. Was the proper response this brutal war? I disagreed with it, and so I felt it was important to protest it. And at one point, I got this idea to paint the yellow ribbons, because they're putting yellow ribbons around the trees, to spray paint them red so it looked like they were blood splattered. And but I was worried if I got the spray paint on the trees, I would be accused of destroying the environment. So I sprayed my hands with the red paint and then smeared the yellow ribbons. And so it looked like I had blood-covered hands. It was hilarious. I didn't mean for it, but a woman walked up to me and she was wearing, I'll never forget it, she was wearing this really classy, like, business dress that was red. So it was like contrasting. And, she looked like she was straight out of England, but she had a Texas drawl, so she was obviously a native Texan. And she said, you deserve to die like the Iraqis. And the thought in my head was, oh my God, lady, you think the Iraqis deserve to die? Like, this isn't a war to liberate Kuwait. You want to genocide Iraq. This isn't, oh my God, Saddam Hussein did something wrong, we need to straighten this out. This is, I want to drop bombs on apartments and kill babies. If you think the Iraqis deserve to die, I didn't care that she thought I deserved to die. Who cares? I just couldn't believe the other end of the equation. And that's what I've encountered my entire time living in the United States, is there is this profound, deep in the bones, in the marrow, just blind hatred of Arabs and Muslims that in many ways I think is actually a reflection of US inherent anti-Semitism, not just because Arabs are Semites. I don't want to get into like, oh, that's what you mean. I think it's replaced it to a degree. Because it's no longer okay to express their hatred towards Jews. I have no doubt that the hatred for Jews is high. We see it, right? In the last few years, we've seen an uptick in anti-Semitic attacks. But what I think has happened, because it's so taboo to say it publicly, they've redirected that hatred into the Arab population, and then they can still express their hatred publicly, because you can say anti-Arab stuff. The president does it all the time and gets away with it. And it's okay. And the fact that it's okay is really shocking and amazing to me. And of course, all of that gets conflated into anti-Muslim stuff. But people forget there are Jewish Arabs and there are Christian Arabs and there are Druze Arabs. This isn't Christian versus Muslim. This isn't Jewish versus Muslim. It is an ethnic war. It is an anti-Arab struggle. It expands, and there's no doubt the United States hates Iranians too, and the United States would love to do this to Persians as well. It's just, I think Iran is too powerful and nobody has the guts to lose another war. I mean, look, you couldn't defeat Iraq. There's no way you're going to defeat Iran. You couldn't win in Afghanistan. How are you going to beat a country like Iran? It's like madness. It's why there hasn't been an attack yet, because it doesn't end well for the attacker.
So, I mean, you mentioned this deep, that you've noticed this deep sort of hatred, and I think I mean, the Ben Shapiro's and Douglas Murray's, and to some extent even Jordan Peterson of this world, and the other sort of the right podcasters have made this very clear, and they get away with a lot. And they've kind of weaponized this identity further, right? But at the same time, there's massive demographic shifts happening, and there's a big power shift that's been occurring over the last 3 decades. Not just China, but you know, the Gulf has a lot of money now. India is kind of rising. People who don't have white pigment are increasingly gaining economic power, both in Western capitals and globally. And so, how sustainable do you think this white vehemence is? And I fear that, you know, as it becomes unsustainable, it's going to become more violent. And just what's your thoughts on that? That will be the final thoughts, and then you can go and enjoy the rest of your Friday afternoon.
So I think you're right. I think it will become more violent, and we're seeing it. I think this is why Trump was elected. So over the course of the last 60 years in the United States, the white population is actually not just shrinking as a percentage of the population, it's actually begun to shrink as an actual number. I forget what the population drop was between the 2010 and 2020 census. I want to say it was something like there's 7 million fewer whites. And it's because whites have negative population growth in Europe and the United States. And so as a result, the white population is shrinking, not just in relationship as a percentage, but as a straight number. In Texas, I think whites are now like 33% of the population. They control every political institution. They're totally in control of the economy. But it's like apartheid South Africa, because they're this minority that tyrannizes the majority. And I believe that the demographic shift in the United States now is 0.4% per year. The white population as a percentage of population shrinks by 0.4. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to do the math on this. If whites are 59% of the population, then in 25 years, whites will no longer be a majority. And that's why Trump was elected. White people stopped making babies, they panicked, and then they wanted to bring in this tough guy who was going to say everything racist they were thinking and do every racist policy that they wanted. And that's why Europe is freaking out and acting the way it is, because of the anti-immigrant sentiment. What's interesting to me, you hinted at it with your thing, that's why I'm bringing it in. If you look at where AfD, which did very well in the last election in Germany, the AfD, the Alternative für Deutschland, the Alternative for Germany, isn't that a great name? The Nazi Party, the new Nazi Party in Germany. They're not the alternative. They're going the guys who want to make it 1933 again. Make the world 1933 again. They did really well in East Germany. Like, if you look at a map of the electoral results, the East German border is there. Like, it's crazy. It's West Germany, East Germany, boom. And the reason they did so well there, interestingly enough, is because of the following. Where there are high immigrant populations, and you got to remember, becoming a German citizen is really difficult. So when I say high immigrant populations, I don't mean those immigrants have become German citizens and started to vote. I mean that they are non-voting people living in Germany. Where there are high immigrant populations, that AfD doesn't do well. It did well in former East Germany, where there isn't a high immigrant population. So the other map you can do is you can put where the immigrants are in Germany, and it looks identical to the map where the AfD did well in Germany, where the lack of contact with immigrants causes paranoia and anti-immigrant hatred. So one of the hopes for humanity is that the more contact you have with the other, with the mysterious, exotic, scary other, the more you understand them, the less likely you are to hate them. Which is why it can't be a surprise to anybody. The big metropolitan areas in the United States are places where you see at least a degree of tolerance and a degree of acceptance. It's the rural parts of the United States where you're seeing the backlash and the anti-immigrant sentiment. And the same is true in places in Europe as well, right? Like if you look at the Brexit vote in the UK, the highly educated Scots, London, even Bristol, all voted against Brexit. It was the rural parts of England that voted for Brexit. And then, of course, one of the things that we know happens to people in their old age is they become isolated because their friends start dying off and their family stops interacting with them. And people who are isolated for prolonged periods of time become paranoid, and paranoid people vote for extreme far right. And so there's also this age demographic factor that's kicked in, especially because the boomers only had one kid each. And so they don't have the kind of children to support them, and they've become isolated and paranoid, and then they're voting for these extremists. And so one of the things that I think could be a hope is Gen Z. I really I've been a professor and a teacher for a long time. And, I started with Gen X, and then I went to millennials, and now I'm on Gen Z. And I feel like Gen Z has an understanding of the world that the other two generations didn't. Millennials are close, but I feel like Gen Z is one step ahead, and I feel like that demographic shift could ultimately, if Gen Z starts to vote, maybe help alleviate some of the crazy that the boomers and Gen X have. I'm X generation, but my generation isn't. We're X because we're an unknown variable. We're going to die as an unknown variable. We didn't do anything. And we're voting right wing now, which is embarrassing. Like, how did this happen? Why is this happening? I think we're seeing the death throes. When empires collapse, they go out violently. That's usually the case. I mean, right, the British Empire didn't, but that's because it had a 350-pound, 70 IQ son to take over. And so it felt like, all right, we'll just hand it over to our guerrilla child, and it'll be fine. But usually when empires collapse, they go out in a thrashing fit, and I think that's what Trump and the United States are doing right now. They're in that moment. My hope is that it doesn't end up a disaster. You mentioned the GCC having money, India having money, China having money. I think that's also a little bit of the hope for the world. Not the current government in India by any means, but India has a history of being a stable democracy, and my thinking is if it can get past this Modi Hindutva kind of right-wing racism that Hungary and the United States are experiencing, India will become a beacon of hope for the whole world. I like what the GCC has been doing. It's been really exciting watching them, work on technologies and do major cultural shifts. Scandinavia is still a place of hope, even though it's not quite as great as it used to be. So there are places that give me pause in my moments of like despair.
Yeah, no, I mean even Africa's going to be the fastest growing continent, both in terms of population and economy in the next while, and I think that's
totally.
It's going to be a massive shift. Professor Roy Casagranda, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure as always. Thank you so much for your time, and until next time.
All right, thank you so much for having me.
Cool, thank you.